You found the skeleton. How would you tell it was dinosaurs? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you might remember one Dr. David Menton. The late Menton died mysteriously during a pandemic while working for an anti-vaccine organization, namely Genesis, whom I'm sure we all know about. Anyway, it turns out that not only did he do a long talk in 2020 about birds not being dinosaurs, in which he lied quite a bit, but he also did a similar talk about humans not being apes. The talk is called 3 Ways to Make an Ape Man, which is just as silly as saying 3 ways to make a reptile lizard, since humans are apes the same way lizards are reptiles. But whatever, let's hear what he's got for us.
Well, my name's David Menton. My background is a human anatomist. So I guess that qualifies me to talk a bit about the human body today.
Well, it certainly makes him more qualified for this task than he was for the dinosaur talk. Maybe this one will be better.
And the whole issue is God didn't make any ape men.
Except for the fact that all humans are apes, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
And then we turn right around after we say God didn't make any ape men. We say 3 ways to make an ape man. Kind of sounds like we're a little confused already up here, doesn't it?
Hey, I didn't say it, but yeah, it really does.
Well, I believe both statements are true. God didn't make any ape men, and for that we'd have to look at Scripture. And what about 3 ways to make an ape man? Well, you've heard of ape man. I guess that's why you're here. Humans make ape men.
Given that all men are apes and that humans make other humans, I'd actually have to agree. It's not like humans burst forth out of oversized pumpkins or something.
Humans make ape men in their mind. They conjure them up.
For a human anatomist, Dr. Menton sure is bad at knowing where babies come from. Maybe he should sit through sex ed again, and watch that live birth video I had to watch. You don't really watch a baby come out of a woman's reproductive system and then forget where babies come from.
And really the whole burden of what we'll be talking about this afternoon is there's 3 ways to do this.
If this isn't the 3 God-approved positions for baby making, I'm going to be disappointed.
And if anyone can think of a 4th way after the lecture's over, come on by and let me know and I'll add it to the lecture.
Oh, I can think of a bunch of ways.
Okay, well, let's dig in. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, so why don't we just begin there too?
Why don't we not? I'm not here for biblical eisegesis. If I wanted to know what a pile of mendacious morons think the Bible means, I'd read the AIG Bible articles. I don't for a reason. I honestly don't often have too many questions about what the Bible means, but when I do, I tend to do things like check the original language, and ask people who actually are scholars and experts in those languages and the biblical text. And if I specifically want to know how a particular faith tradition interprets those verses, I'll check with the famous works in that group, like St. Thomas Aquinas for Catholics, or St. Clement of Alexandria for the Eastern Orthodox, or John Calvin for some groups of Protestants. Please note that this is not an exclusive list for any of those groups. AIG's interpretations, inspired by the prophetess they reject anyway, have no interest for me at all. And even less so in the context of a video on this channel, where the most theological I think I've ever gotten is saying that the doctrine of perspicuity of the scriptures is nonsensical on its face, given the current state of schisms among those Christians who accept it. All that being said, I think it's time to cut ahead to when Menton is done quoting scripture at us. In case you're wondering, in this talk about human evolution, Dr. Menton takes some time to be homophobic, because of course he does.
Well, evolutionists have a very different view, of course, of the origin of man. This is a very famous evolutionist, comes from that Huxley family that were great champions of Charles Darwin.
Imagine citing something from 50 years ago in a talk about a field that's moving as rapidly as paleoanthropology.
And this is Julian Huxley from a lecture he gave at the University of Chicago several years ago when they had a big meeting celebrating Darwin's, 200th birthday at the time. He said, in the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. He said, the earth was not created, it evolved. Now get this, so did all of the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, our mind and soul, as well as brain and body, and so did religion.
Okay, cool, but in 2018, Brad Kramer said, many people today, both Christians and non-Christians, assume that creation and evolution are contradictory beliefs. that a person either believes in a creator god or they believe in a natural process like evolution. I understand this perspective because I once held it myself. I still believe that God is the creator of all things, but my perspective on evolution has shifted. I now see evolution as simply a way of understanding God's creation through the lens of science. How did I change my mind about evolution? The first step was encountering faithful, trustworthy Christians who didn't fit into the boxes of creationist or evolutionist. These Christians showed me a deeper and better way to reconcile my faith with the discoveries of science. They helped me to understand the scientific evidence behind evolution and to more faithfully interpret the biblical account of creation. The list of these Christians include Francis Collin, Tim Keller, John Walton, and N.T. Wright, among many others. So I guess by the standard that some guy says a thing means it's true, evolution isn't incompatible with belief in God, including specifically Christianity.
Have you thought about that? Religion itself, according to evolution, would have had to evolve. Everything that's real has to evolve.
That raises so many questions, like, what do you mean by real? That's not a trivial question either. What it means to be real is a vexatious question in philosophy. Like, is math real? To be real, does something have to be a physical object? What counts as physical? Also, what do you mean by evolution? Because in the sense of the theory of evolution, it only applies to living things. Rocks and stars certainly did not evolve in the same sense that humans or elephants or pine trees did. Of course, what this probably means is that science broadly doesn't accept God as an explanatory mechanism, and David wishes it did. But if he just comes out and says it, it'll be too obvious even to the friendly audience he's preaching to, that he was just an anti-science liar, and so he just uses evolution as a synonym for science he doesn't like. Which, by the way, is virtually all of science.
And so far from God explaining how man came to be, man will now, through evolution, explain how we came to come up with God.
That would be a matter of cultural development, not biological evolution. The science involved would primarily be things like sociology and anthropology rather than evolutionary biology. Although, given that human brains evolved and those brains are the things capable of believing in gods, evolution does help explain the existence of humans capable of having such beliefs, so it's not irrelevant.
I've come to the conclusion that evolution can be considered a jealous God that will have no other gods before it. That is, nothing can be held above it as being higher than God.
Interesting. Let's see if evolution would qualify as a god under common usages of that term. I'll use Merriam-Webster, as it's sort of the go-to for American English, and this is a talk given in that form of English. So definition 1 is, quote, the supreme or ultimate reality, end quote. Well, evolution is an emergent phenomenon that only happens to living things. It's certainly not the ultimate reality because it's very contingent on the universe existing, so that's a no. Definition 2 is, quote, a being or object that is worshipped as having more than natural attributes and powers, end quote. Well, that doesn't fit. Evolution is a solidly naturalistic phenomenon, and there are no temples of evolution where it is being worshipped. Definition 3 is a person or thing of supreme value. Well, evolution is neither a person or a thing, but rather a process, so nope. Definition 4 is a powerful ruler. Evolution isn't a person that can rule anything, so again, no. In no way is evolution a god, jealous or otherwise.
Well, let's look at what's the basic argument for human evolution. First of all, what's the pattern? What is supposed to have happened? This chart presumes to go back about 5 million years ago here. This 5 represents 5 million years.
I want to point out that this chart is apparently one made by Answers in Genesis, not by some actual scientific publication. Also, you can't just put an abbreviated generic name without at some point giving the actual full name. So at least one instance of a period should actually read Australopithecus, and also Homo should be italicized. Really, these wouldn't be huge problems normally, but it's just another example of the pervasive lack of concern for accuracy that is all over young Earth creationism. For a group that sees themselves as maverick scientists working against the blinkered and dogmatic consensus to get the world to see the actual truth, they really don't care about getting things right. If you're a creationist and you're watching this, if you want to be taken seriously by the scientific community, but you can't get even basic formatting and language use right, it's just not going to happen. You might also want to start fact-checking things, but that's probably a bridge too far. If you did that, it'd be hard to stay a creationist, at least of the anti-evolution variety.
And according to evolutionists, at about that time, there'd be other people pick a different time, but about the 5 million point, there was a split here in this creature right here that's called an ape-like creature. They never call it an ape, they always call it an ape-like creature.
I'll call it an ape. Apes are members of the superfamily Hominoidea, which includes the modern-day gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. Apes have certain morphological characteristics in common, which we'll get more into later. But the common ancestor of all of them would also have had these morphological traits and would therefore be an ape.
If they called it an ape, they would be showing that over 5 million years, apes evolved into what? Apes.
Yep, because that's how evolution works. Once a clade is established, it either goes extinct or diversifies. But no matter how much apes diversify, they'll always be apes, just like they'll always be mammals.
That's why they avoid calling that ancestor that's supposed to be a common ancestor of humans and apes an ape-like creature.
No, it's not. It's because creationists too often have taken the statement, humans evolved from apes, to mean that humans evolved from modern ape species, like gorilla or pan troglodytes. Hence the question, if humans evolved from apes, then why are there still apes? Which betrays profound ignorance of how the whole thing works. I think that this was an overcorrection and also gives the false impression that the common ancestor of all apes wouldn't recognizably be an ape, when it certainly would have been. Humans and modern apes evolved from an ape.
Well, I happen to believe that apes came from ape-like creatures. I think chickens came from chicken-like creatures too, don't you think?
Yep, that's how evolution works. The ancestor of some taxon was itself a member of that taxon. The common ancestor of all chickens was a chicken. The common ancestor of all ground fowl was a ground fowl. The common ancestor of all birds was a bird. The common ancestor of all theropods was a theropod. The common ancestor of all dinosaurs was a dinosaur. The common ancestor of all reptiles was a reptile. The common ancestor of all vertebrates was a vertebrate, etc.
The problem is this other one. And by the way, notice they don't waste much time and effort producing intermediates here. I could put in Dryopithecus or a few things like that.
And Cevapithecus, Gigantopithecus, Otavapithecus, Akembo, Proconsul, Hiazanopithecus, Mabokopithecus, Rucubiopithecus, Orangmopithecus, Turcanopithecus, Pliobates, Griffopithecus, Afropithecus, Heliopithecus, Nicholopithecus, Equatorius, Kenyapithecus, Encarapithecus, Lufangpithecus, Uranopithecus, Rudopithecus, Hispanopithecus, Puralopithecus, Anuopithecus, Nacalipithecus, Sumburupithecus, Cororopithecus, and Gracopithecus. Oh wait, that's 30 different ape genera, all more closely related to other apes than humans, or basal to humans and other apes. So, about 10 times as much diversity as Menton had on his entire chart. So I guess the scientists are in fact doing a lot of work on the other apes, and Menton just lied to us. Or just doesn't actually know anything about work on fossil primates. Certainly the fossil record of non-human hominoids could be much better, but pretending that it's something that's just being ignored, or for which we don't have data, is simply ludicrous.
But basically, nothing much happens from here to here. You're going from an ape to an ape.
That's what's happening on the other side, too. It's just we're being more specific about what ape we're talking about. In this case, it's Homo sapiens.
It's this direction that gets all the interest.
Breaking news. Humans tend to be interested in humans.
And that's why when an evolutionist finds a primate in the fossil record, there's much more impetus to call it an ancestor of humans than to just make it a dead ape or ancestor of apes.
Yeah, that's why after one quick trip to the internet, I found 30 fossil ape genera that are either basal to humans plus other apes, or are more closely related to non-human apes than to humans by the consensus of the paleontology community. No one cares about Turcanopithecus. That's why searching it on Google Scholar turns up hundreds of papers. It's one thing to disagree with the consensus in science. That's a good thing. We need iconoclasts in science, because science gets things wrong sometimes.
Science is a liar sometimes.
And it's people who disagree with the consensus that can help push science to correct itself. But one of the things that shows that you're not an iconoclast scientist, but instead just a crank, is making it clear that you don't actually understand the consensus position. In fact, it's a sign of pseudoscience, and at best, that's what young Earth creationism is. Menton was just now displaying for all to see that he was not a serious person.
Here's it's not meant to be exhaustive here, just some of the major points we read about and hear about.
I appreciate him saying that this isn't all the known taxa that could be on the chart. And that's fair enough. But if he decides to, say that his question marks or relative sparsity of taxa on his own chart is somehow a problem for evolution after himself pointing out that this is not the full picture, then we know for certain that he was dishonest and not just ignorant. Also, I want to point out that the x-axis is supposed to be how ape-like something is, but you can't do that and have other apes on both ends of the axis. Humans are as ape-like as it is possible to be, because they're 100% apes. There is nothing about a human that is not ape-like. It's like having a chart with an x-axis that is canine-like on one end and fox-like on the other. Sure, foxes might not be the most typical members of subfamily Caninae, but they're completely canine-like because they just are canines.
The first one out of the chute here that we're identifying is Ardipithecus rumitus.
And right there is one of the reasons you follow the rules for when and how you abbreviate binomials for species. There's just a bunch of A's on this chart, and none of them are identified. And they're not even all for the same genus. There's Ardipithecus and also Australopithecus. That just makes the chart confusing.
Some would just call it Australopithecus rumitus. We'll talk about that in a bit.
The only papers I can find using Australopithecus ramidus are from about 3 decades ago, and there are only 2 of them. I don't think anyone is still using the term. In fact, while it was first published as Australopithecus ramidus, the new name was amended to Ardipithecus ramidus only a few months later after the initial publication, and near as I can tell, no one has since been using the original name, as there really hasn't been any dispute that I can find that the species is distinct enough to warrant its own generic designation. Now, to be fair, what a genus is fundamentally arbitrary, so all of this doesn't really matter too much. But, yet again, it's that pervasive lack of familiarity with the literature, or care to actually get the science right, that permeates creationism. If creationists were actually the warriors for truth that they tell people they are, then why do they care so little about actually getting things right? Instead, we just get fabrication, quote mines, sloppy references that would embarrass someone in high school, never mind a person with a PhD who's presumably been trained on how to do things like fact-check and cite sources, honestly, as well as to do a literature search in order to ascertain and understand the consensus in any given field, even if they reject that consensus.
Then there's Australopithecus anamensis. You notice we're going to have a lot of creatures now with A in front of their name. That stands for Australopithecus.
Yeah, except when it doesn't, like with the last organism we talked about.
Which translates southern ape. Australo, like Australia, Pithecus meaning an ape. So this is Australopithecus anamensis, supposed to be somewhere between rumitus and this next famous one up here. This one you've all heard of. That's Lucy. You've heard of Lucy, haven't you?
I can't say that this is wrong, but it's sloppy use of language that reinforces incorrect ideas about paleoanthropology. Australopithecus afarensis does not equate with the individual commonly known as Lucy, or to give her more formal designation, AL288-1. She was a member of that species and is not the only one. We have many other individuals of that species that have been found, studied, and described, and she is not the sole or even primary source of information on the species. She is notable for her completeness and place in the history of the field of paleoanthropology, but by equating her with the whole species, it lends itself to the belief that creationists never seem to want to counter that essentially everything that is known about Australopithecus afarensis as a species, or even Australopithecus as a genus, is based on her, and anything that isn't part of AL288-1 is just a mystery, and anyone who reconstructs an Australopithecus with parts that aren't present in her, such as a full spine or hands or feet, is just speculating about those parts of the anatomy, which simply isn't true.
Lucy is a name given to one specimen of this particular creature, and the scientific name is Australopithecus afarensis.
You know what? Credit where it's due. I didn't know he'd point out that she's just one specimen of the species, which does a lot to counter the idea that we base all our knowledge of the creatures on her specifically. I don't think it's entirely enough, but it's more than I'm used to getting on this topic, so hey, props to the late Dr. Ment.
Now we get a fork in the road, and one branch goes over here, and the other branch goes over here. In this particular drawing, not every evolutionist would agree with this. What you're looking at there is Australopithecus africanus, not to be confused with afarensis. Some people say it sort of became extinct. We call that a collateral relative that didn't make it.
I had never heard the term collateral relative before, because it's a term from genealogy, not phylogeny, and this is about phylogeny. In genealogical terms, it means a relative who is not your direct ancestor, so like a cousin. But in this case, I guess if it just means a relative of an extant species that left no living descendants, then it's the same as the term stem. So plesiosaurs are stem turtles, and in Menton's terminology, that would make them collateral relatives of turtles. It's weird for no reason to just come up with a new term for something that already has a perfectly serviceable name, but whatever, I'm not in charge of what goes on at AIG. I just point out how dumb it is.
Evolutionists call it that.
No, they don't. Genealogists do. Evolutionary biology isn't genealogy, although there are some commonalities between them. In genealogy, collateral relatives are people on your family tree who are not your ancestor, so siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles. Always a good sign when the person giving a talk can't get what topic he's even talking about right. And yet again, we just have an example where creationists just don't care to be accurate. They don't care about being truthful.
Others would put Africanus down here on this route going from Lucy up to a relatively recent discovery, and that's Australopithecus sediba. And I'll be talking about that and Lucy at some length.
I'm looking forward to it.
Then about 2 million years ago, we get our genus Homo. How many genera of Homo do we have today?
One, because Homo is a genus. It's like asking how many suits in a deck of cards are hearts. One, because hearts is a suit. What would it mean for there to be more than one suit of hearts in a deck of cards? I don't know. It's nonsense. Homo is the single genus of genus Homo, because Homo is a genus.
One.
Yes, genus Homo is one genus, like all genera are.
Homo means ourself, basically.
No, it's Latin for man or human, but not man as in male, which is the word vir.
Yeah, there's just one. How many species of human beings or Homo do we have alive today?
Hey, look, a question that actually makes sense. And the answer is one.
Just one, Homo sapiens. Sapiens means smart cookie.
It means thinking, and is a reference to the ability of humans to have abstract powers of thought and complex communication to a degree unparalleled among extant organisms. I know he was probably just saying that as some kind of joke, but before you joke about science, you should make sure people actually know what's really going on so they don't think your joke is true.
Or wise. You can see who named us, so we named ourselves.
Well, it was Carolus Linnaeus, but yes, he was indeed a member of the species Homo sapiens.
And then now we're getting the really delicate stuff here that you very hard to see the difference. There's what's called subspecies or incipient species. How many subspecies of humans do we have today?
Also one, and there are no recognized subspecies of H. sapiens in the fossil record either.
You were on a good roll there. You can hold up one finger again. Yeah, it'd be one. Or Homo sapiens, subspecies sapiens. In other words, if you didn't think we were smart the first time, we repeat it.
No, that's not why if there were more than one subspecies of H. sapiens, the one modern humans belong to would be H. sapiens sapiens. It's because when subspecies are defined, the subspecies to which the specimen that defined the species in the first place belonged is just given the same subspecific name as the specific name. So because Canis lupus, the gray wolf, was first described based on the Eurasian gray wolf, that subspecies is Canis lupus lupus. But the Arctic wolf, which lives only in North America and Greenland, is C. lupus arctos, because that subspecies is distinct from the one originally used to describe the species as a whole. Menton could choose to be informative, but he apparently kept making active choices to tell misleading jokes instead.
Now let's get down to a really narrow area, and that is how many races? That's even below subspecies yet.
Racial categories in humans are arbitrarily socially constructed categories based on largely superficial factors like skin pigmentation, eye color, hair texture, and the shape of various soft tissue facial features like lip fullness, nose shape, and the presence or absence of epicanthic folds in adults. All of this represents only a tiny fraction of human genetic diversity, and these traits are not distributed in discrete groups. Human races are a product of human culture, not human biology.
Subspecies interbreed, species can interbreed. Now we're down to race. And after the Human Genome Project, you may have heard about, where they sequenced the genes of humans, there have been several people groups who have been sequenced. The scientists have come to the conclusion that there's only one race. There's not enough difference among us to really classify us in different races. So I guess you could just say what? The human race. That's pretty much it.
Biologically, yes, human races do not really exist. However, because humans all exist within wider cultural frameworks, the way that those cultures racially categorize humans can have effects on the life circumstances of those humans in various racial categories. Societies have often and still often treat members differently based on what perceived racial category those persons fall into, and that cannot be ignored in some misguided effort to not be racist by just saying there are no races. That race is essentially a figment of society's collective imagination doesn't mean that we can just ignore the way that it affects people. But oh no! I guess I'm teaching critical race theory or something. I'd better stop that before Marjorie Taylor Greene asks how much funding the USGS has given me to teach people that, let me check. Right, that racism exists and has existed.
We're all brothers and sisters ultimately.
Look, I'm with Menton on the commonality of humanity, and that humans should see each other as members of a single family rather than as a series of categories, all but one of which are conceived of as other. But the problem is that Answers in Genesis promotes color blindness and harps continuously that children shouldn't be taught about the effects of the past and present racism. And their excuse for this is that races aren't real. That doesn't help anyone. And while my purpose here isn't to have a conversation about racial justice, it bugs me that Answers in Genesis will oppose actual attempts to correct for racism both past and present, while couching it in terms that they think make them look totally not racist, you guys.
Well, let's get into the science of the lecture. I'll try to make it educational as well as boring.
Well, my history with Menton seems to indicate that it will be boring on his end, but also not educational. In fact, whatever the opposite of that is. Like miseducational or something. Hopefully, though, the entertainment part can be supplied by myself. But then, it's not like I spend a lot of time watching my own content here, so maybe I'm boring. I don't know. Hey, if I'm boring, tell me so in the comments. If I'm not, tell me that too. Heck, just like and subscribe and do the YouTube stuff. I could use more algorithm magic here on the tube of views.
What's the difference between an ape and a human, huh?
Oh boy, so let's get into it. Now, if you've watched my previous series where Menton tells us about how birds are not dinosaurs, you'll know that he entirely failed to do the one thing that you have to do to have that kind of discussion. He didn't define what a dinosaur is, what a bird is, and then show us, based on those definitions, how birds didn't meet the criteria for being a dinosaur. Basically, his argument was exactly the same as saying that whales can't be mammals because mammals don't have blowholes and they have 4 legs, while whales have no legs and 2 flippers. I already know I don't need to tell you why that argument doesn't work. So, since I can basically guarantee that Menton won't bother to define ape, let's do it here. In morphological terms, which is what Menton focuses on, taxa tend to be defined by synapomorphies, that is, shared derived traits found uniquely in the group in question that are not found in other groups. That is in contrast to plesiomorphies, which are shared traits of a taxon that are also shared by a larger, higher taxon. So, for example, having a placenta is a synapomorphy for eutherian mammals. In fact, it's rather the defining trait of eutherian mammals. But it's a plesiomorphy for apes, since apes are part of a much larger group of mammals with placentas. Now, I'm not going to list every last synapomorphy or plesiomorphy of apes, but I'll go through enough that we can easily use this definition to look at any animal and say that it is or is not an ape, provided we have enough of its body available to study. First, let's start with some plesiomorphic traits of apes so we know where apes are on the larger tree of life. Apes have a spine. This makes them vertebrates. They have 4 limbs, making them tetrapods. Apes make milk, making them mammals. Apes develop from a placenta during pregnancy, making them eutherians. Apes have fingernails instead of claws and orbits that are entirely enclosed in bone, making them primates. Apes have a dry nose as opposed to a wet nose like most mammals, making them monkeys. Apes have a 2-1-2-3 dental formula. That is, 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars in any one quadrant of the jaw. That is, top left or right, or bottom left or right. They also have nostrils that open facing down rather than to the side. Both of these traits indicate that apes are catarrhine or old world monkeys as opposed to the platyrrhines like tamarins or marikis. Apes have tails that fuse into a coccyx and do not extend past the body wall. They have Y5 molars and very flexible shoulder joints that probably, at least in the first apes, were used for brachiation, something even humans can do, albeit not as well as a chimpanzee, gibbon, or orangutan. Now, let's look at some random animals to see if they're apes or not. We'll pick 6 species: Elephas maximus, the Asian elephant, Phascolarctos cinereus, the koala, Gallus gallus, the chicken, Phormia monilus, the necklace starfish, Mandrillus sphinx, the mandrill, and finally Homo sapiens, the human. Okay, so let's go through first our plesiomorphies, and then if we can get there, our ape synapomorphies. First, the elephant. Well, it has a spine, 4 limbs, and they make milk and have placentas. So, they're with apes at least until eutheria, but they don't have fingernails or enclosed orbits, so they're not primates. If they're not primates, then they can't be apes, so elephants are not apes. Let's look at the koala next. Well, it, like the elephant, has a spine, 4 limbs, and they make milk, but they don't have placentas, so they're not even with the apes into eutheria, they are instead metatherians. Since you have to be a eutherian to be an ape, koalas are not apes. Well, let's take a look at the chicken. They have a spine, 4 limbs, but don't make milk, so they're not mammals. Chickens, therefore, cannot be apes. How about the necklace starfish? Well, it doesn't even have a spine, so it's not even a vertebrate, making it most certainly not an ape. Now here's a tricky one, the mandrill. It has a spine, 4 limbs, milk, and a placenta, so we know it's a therian, like apes. But it also has fingernails, enclosed orbits, a dry nose, and a 2-1-2-3 dental formula, and nostrils that face down. So it's a catarrhine monkey, the closest to apes so far. But does it have the distinct synapomorphies of an ape? Well, it doesn't have a coccyx, instead having a short tail. It doesn't have Y5 molars, nor does it have the superflexible shoulder joints of an ape. So despite being very close to being an ape, mandrills are not apes. Last and certainly not least, we come to Homo sapiens. Well, humans have a spine, 4 limbs, milk, a placenta, fingernails, enclosed orbits, a dry nose, a 2-1-2-3 dental formula, and nostrils that face down. Right now, humans are hanging out with the mandrills as catarrhine monkeys. But humans also have a very flexible shoulder joint, a coccyx rather than a full tail, and Y5 molars, putting them solidly in the ape category. See, this is how you tell if an animal is or is not part of a morphologically defined group. You define the group using the morphological traits both that it shares with the larger taxa to which it belongs, but also the traits unique to it. Once again, I want to stress that my list of traits is not complete, and while I do think it's sufficient at the lay level for anyone to figure out if an animal is an ape or not, it wouldn't pass muster in a peer-reviewed paper because it leaves out a lot. So let's see how Menton did it, and I can guarantee it won't be in any way that's useful.
The skull is the most interesting thing to look at. Wouldn't you agree the skull is more interesting here than, say, the toe bone?
Yes, I would agree that the skull is more interesting than the pedal phalanges, but both are important, and I'm not sure I'd agree that the skull is the most important thing, but it's sure in the mix.
What's the difference between an ape and a human if we start looking at the skull? Look at other parts. I have a list for you here. We can just go right down the list. And I'll illustrate it with some skulls. These are made out of resin or plastic, so they're not real skulls, but they look real. They're pretty expensive, too. They're a replica.
I needed a new heel for my shoe. So I decided to go to Morganville, which is what they call Shelbyville in those days. So
This
I
is
tied
human.
an onion to my belt.
And the
which was
first difference
style at
between
the time.
apes and humans we could point out are the nose bones, the nasal bones right here. If you break your nose, that's what you break. You break the nasal bones, okay? And we have 2 of them. You can see the seam in the middle if you look close. And they're like a little awning that hang out at the front of our face here. And apes don't have protruding nasal bones.
Well, what does it mean to say that apes don't have protruding nasal bones, but that humans do? Well, since we are trying to argue whether humans are or are not apes, we need to see if this alleged characteristic means that humans are missing a plesiomorphic or synapomorphic trait of apes. But they aren't. The protruding nasal bone is a derived characteristic in humans, just like flippers are a derived characteristic in whales. You can't use either flippers or a protruding nasal bone to distinguish whales from mammals or humans from apes. You have to show some key feature that apes do have that humans don't. Pointing out that humans are unique within apes is all well and good, and that's why we treat humans as a distinct species, rather than just, a variety of some other species of ape. But it doesn't help us say humans are not apes. You might not be surprised to hear, but what I just said is going to be a theme for the rest of the series.
Let's take a look at this. This is a chimp here. This is supposed to be the most similar to humans of living primates. You've all probably seen a chimpanzee. And it has nasal bones right here, but they're flat. So next time you're at the zoo, you might want to do an experiment. Go up to the biggest, meanest looking silverback gorilla you can find, get a hold of his schnoz. You can push it all over his face because it's all soft tissue, no bone in it. Now, they get testy, so I don't recommend doing this, actually.
Yay for jokes about harassing zoo animals! But actually, as you can see in this picture of a gorilla skull, gorillas actually do have raised nasal bones. I guess that makes gorillas a kind of human, or at least not apes. Odd choice of characteristics to show that humans aren't apes, but as we'll see, this won't be the last time that Menton gives some criterion for being human and not ape that at least some gorillas meet. I guess some gorillas are human and not ape. I wonder, if you're into the idea of universal atonement, does that mean that Jesus died for some gorillas but not others? Do some gorillas descend from Adam but not others? Who knows? Menton is just making this up as he goes, I think.
Here's another, I'm sorry, we got these backwards. This is, this is an orangutan. This is the chimp. I normally have them set up, but we got them backwards this time. So this is the chimp here. But once again, just like the orangutan you just saw, flattened nasal bones. Okay?
Okay, flat nasal bones are the basal state for apes. Not sure how pointing out that humans are derived helps say that they're not apes. Again, this is just like saying that mammals don't have blowholes, but whales do, so whales aren't mammals. All that is really saying is that whales have unusual noses for mammals, which in fact humans also do. But that doesn't make whales or humans not mammals. And it certainly doesn't make humans not apes. Which trait unique to apes as a group do humans lack? It's none.
And there's another feature that's so tiny you're going to think I'm picky just to even mention it. But if you do a little experiment, put your finger like a mustache under your nose and go up, you will hit a little bony spur sticking out. A little piece of bone. I'll show you that piece if the cameras can get in really close here now. It's this little point. Can you see it on the screen at all? They haven't been able to put a sunscreen, have they? This little point here is what we call the nasal spine. If we look at apes, they do not have a nasal spine at all.
Okay, so let's think about the scenario evolution would indicate. Humans are supposed to have evolved within the superfamily Hominoidea, that is, the apes. Now, most apes share with most other monkeys the flat nose and prognathic face that is common to all of them. But humans started to take on a distinct morphology, which of course involves changes to the skull. One of these changes is a bulbous nose with hooded nostrils, which requires bony support, so humans evolved bony support. Now, Mented comes along and says that because humans have a unique morphology that they can't have evolved. But that's just him saying that humans evolved, so they couldn't have evolved. That doesn't make any sense. It's just as valid as noting that only some groups of humans typically retain epicanthic folds into adulthood, and then declaring that because they have this atypical feature, they don't count as humans anymore. Being unique within a group doesn't take you outside of the group.
And there's a good reason for that. You might ask, what is the nasal spine doing? Is it just there so we can make mustache once in a while?
It's supporting the cartilage that makes up the septum.
No, you see, the nasal spine is a ledge on which our nasal septum, which divides our nasal cavity into two halves. In humans, because our face is flat, a bit of the nasal septum actually protrudes from the nasal cavity, and it sits on top of the spine. You can see a little groove in there where it sits in that groove. Apes have a sloped face, okay? Apes have a sloped face. Can you all notice that? Okay, this isn't too subtle, is it here?
So over in the real world, where scientists do, science, that's called prognathism and refers to how much of the maxilla and premaxilla protrude. But wouldn't you know it that prognathism decreases throughout hominin evolution? And again, since having a flat face is a distinct human quality, Menton is saying that humans couldn't be apes because that would involve evolution, which is the very thing he's trying to argue against. You don't get to assume your conclusion in order to argue for it. That's what we in the biz call begging the question.
People say, yeah, but what if you hold it like that? Then it would be a vertical face. You go by the cheekbones.
He's right there. The zygomatic bone is used to help orient the skull so prognathism can be objectively compared across ape species.
Okay. When the cheekbones here, called the zygomatic arch, when that's parallel to the table or the floor, that's about the way the skull would have set on the head of the ape. And notice the slope. If you run a line out the cheekbone that's the kind of slope we're talking about. Not very subtle, is it? Pretty obvious. You take a human skull, you do the same thing. We have a cheekbone too. It's called homology. Same basic bone, same name, serve similar function.
Yeah, almost like there's an evolutionary relationship there. Weird.
That would be parallel to the ground on a human too, and if you run it out to the plane of the face, essentially perpendicular.
Cool, but we have intermediate fossils that show the reduction in prognathism over time. In fact, Australopithecus africanus and A. afarensis are already less prognathic than a chimpanzee, or an orangutan, and Homo habilis is even less so. But it's still considerably more prognathic than modern humans. Homo rudolfensis is even less prognathic still, and by the time we get to H. ergaster or H. heidelbergensis, we are at essentially a modern level of prognathism. So how do we draw the line? What measurement can we make to delineate the amount of prognathism that's so much that the animal in question isn't human? And yet again, this is Menton just saying that if humans evolved from apes, that makes them too different from other apes to have evolved from apes. It's a nonsense argument.
So those are some differences right off the bat. The slope of the face, the presence of the protruding nasal bones for a human, the lack of a nasal spine in apes, but it's present in humans. If we look at our orangutan over here, the same thing is true. No nasal spine in there.
Thanks for telling everyone that humans have the most derived skull among extant apes. I don't think that was in dispute, though.
The reason apes don't have it is because their face is sloped and the nasal septum is recessed further inside the skull. With a vertical face, the nasal bone protrudes a little bit. So there's really a reason behind all of these things that I'm showing you. What else can we say? The shape of the forehead. Humans have a curved forehead right here. This is curved, okay? You might want to do a little experiment right on your own body. You put your hand up here on your forehead, get the shape, and then when you take it away, look at it. Now, if you take your hand away and it looks like this, we need to talk right after the lecture, okay? Come by. You ought to have a curvature like this, just like this model of a human skull is. What about apes? The upper part of their face is flat.
Give me a second to calm down a bit so I don't fly off the handle. Okay, so this is the first instance where it seems hard to conclude that Menton is being honest, and I'm forced to consider it is more likely that he was lying than that he was just incompetent. You see, when he checked for that curvature on the human skull, he put his hand across the anterodorsalmost portion of the frontal bone, well above the orbit, and not really in contact with the zygomatic bone or the maxilla. But on the chimpanzee skull, he put his hand right across the orbit, covering the supraorbital margin, the nasal bones, and portions of the maxilla that make up the ventromedial portions of the margin of the orbits and the lacrimal bone. All of that is much flatter than the actual part of the frontal bone on the chimp that houses the brain, as can be plainly seen when he holds up the skull so that it's in dorsal view relative to the camera. Humans also have relatively flat faces across the orbits, although less so than chimps. And the more ventral part of their frontal bones are also curved, like those of humans. Menton just lied on stage and didn't even bother to hide it. Rather, he just showed it off blatantly. If you're a creationist watching this, I want you to consider something. Why is it that it's trivially easy for people with barely an undergraduate level of understanding in a given field to show that creationists are not just wrong in that field, but often in ways that make being honestly mistaken hard to accept as an explanation, and rather seem to indicate intentional dishonesty? In short, why do your fellow creationists lie so much? We're approaching flat Earth levels of dishonesty. I half expect Menton, after being shown the exquisitely complete fossil record of hominins, to say, interesting, like Jeranism after he demonstrated quite conclusively that the Earth was round in his own experiment.
You have a backup experiment. If you're seeing through this hole, through the next hole, and seeing the light at the backboard or at 17 feet off the water, the Earth is flat. If he's holding it up at 23 feet high and we're seeing the light, well, that's because the Earth's curved. So I should only be able to see it when it's at 17 feet. Enrique, how high is your light?
17 feet.
We don't see you, Enrique. Lift up your light way above your head. Interesting.
You can see it here, and you can see it in the orangutan here.
Once again, putting his hand over the orbit and not the forehead. Look, Menton was a human anatomist. There's no way you can tell me he doesn't know the difference between orbits and foreheads. That's why I can't really attribute this nonsense to anything but dishonesty. There's no way he got a postgraduate degree involving human anatomy and then just honestly makes this mistake.
Okay, that leads to yet another trait that is distinctive between humans and apes. Think of two ice cream cones with the big end facing you. Okay, no ice cream in this talk, just the cones. They would be two circles, just like this. Imagine now if you cut to make a curved forehead. Remember the curved forehead we talked about? If you made a cut across those cones, they would become oval, and they would be cut back on the side. That's exactly what we see in a human. Instead of looking goggle-eyed with a nice big tall round goggle-shaped orbit, it's more oval.
Okay, but gorillas also have non-round orbits, and they have lateral margins of the orbits that are swept back in some individuals. See, I told you that we get more reason that at least some gorillas are human, according to Menton. Maybe gorillas get their own incarnation. Was there a gorilla Jesus who was crucified by a mob of chimps for the sins of the human gorillas? Plus, just like with prognathism, we have increasingly modern orbit shapes as we go through Australopithecus into early genus Homo and then later genus Homo. The whole transitional series is there, including that yes, humans are distinct among apes, but they still remain derived apes.
And that's because it's been cut. Basically, think of it as being cut in a curved forehead here. What that does is it exposes the side. If you look at the side of the skull, you can look right into the orbit, at the medial bones of the orbit here from the side. If you try this with our friend the orangutan here, you don't get much view of the orbits from the side.
Cool, do it with Australopithecus africanus. Oh, whoops. Looks like there's some curvature there. Oh, and just to pick a few transitional forms, there it is in Homo habilis, but even more so, and then there it is even more prominent in H. heidelbergensis.
So that's a collection of things. I think we've hit everything. Oh, I added one just recently. We've been talking about this cheekbone, right? The zygomatic arch. And I mentioned that humans have it. We do indeed. It's right here. And apes have it, like this chimp here.
Yep, we know. Get to the point.
What do we have that for? That is a kind of protection of a muscle that comes down here. The muscle's attached to the skull, and we call this the temporal part of the skull. It attaches there. You can even see a line on this chimp where the muscle attached. And then that muscle goes down through that hole to the mandible here, to a process on the mandible. And that's a muscle of chewing. When that muscle contracts, it bites, okay? In fact, I've just been bitten, I think. There we go. So look at how big the muscle is on this chimp. It's this whole area. I can get 3 fingers comfortably in there, and almost a fourth. Okay? This human would have been much bigger than that chimp in body size. But look at the size of the space where this temporalis muscle passes through. It's very tiny here.
Some ape had to have the proportionally smallest temporalis muscle. That it's humans doesn't make them not apes. We could just as well say the gorilla with the strongest bite force of any primate, and hence the biggest temporalis muscles of all the apes, proportionally, isn't an ape, because the temporalis muscles are so big. Or let's go with that because gibbons have the longest arms proportionally among all the apes, that they're not actually apes. Or hey, among hominids, bonobos have the smallest brains. Maybe that makes them not apes. Of course, the real answer is that all taxa are internally diverse, and in any given one, some group must be the most extreme in some measurement. I don't know what it is, and I don't really care to find out, but I guarantee you that among the animals traditionally in the subfamily Caninae, that is the canines, that one species on average has the smallest temporalis muscles proportional to the rest of the skull. I don't think Menton would argue that that is an indication that that particular species is a different creation from the others.
And we still have a temporalis muscle, just like other creatures do. Attaches to the temple, goes down through there, but it's much smaller.
Hey guys, just because some part of your anatomy is much smaller than normal, it doesn't make you a different species or anything. We're not going to measure whether or not you belong just by measuring one part of your body. That's not how taxonomy works. We'll measure lots of parts.
You've heard of Lucy, we already mentioned her. And people may have told you, well, she's almost human, or she's on her way to becoming human. Let's just look at the zygomatic arch, something you never worried about before, but now when you look at an ape man, you're going to be looking for the zygomatic arch, right? If you look at that, I'll tell you, you get bit by a creature like Lucy, you're going to stay bit. That's just massive. I can get 4 fingers through this. And how tall was Lucy?
Like about a meter tall, if I remember correctly. A little more, I think, but not much.
3 feet 7 inches tall.
Hey, look at that. I'd say 1 meter and 9 centimeters, which is what that turns into, is pretty much spot on for a meter plus a little more. I'm going to call that me correctly remembering how tall Lucy is. That's pretty good, since I routinely forget how tall Tyrannosaurus Rex is, and people seem to think I should have that number tucked away to my brain, ready to go.
With chewing muscles this size, that I don't think any human being has ever existed with the temporalis muscles being that thick.
Yep, that's probably outside the range for Homo sapiens, but, you know, Australopithecus afarensis isn't Homo sapiens. Hence, the different names. So I'm not sure what the point is. No one is disputing that Lucy was an ape. Also, what's the cutoff? How big do the temporalis muscles have to be before we can confidently conclude that the skull in question belonged to an ape and not a human? I'm going to go ahead and guess that we'll never get to hear what the cutoff is, much less any actual defense of that cutoff.
So that's kind of here's another little trick you can look for in an ape. We call this a dental arcade. Humans have a arch like the St. Louis arch.
New heel for my shoe. So I decided to go to Morganville, which is what they call Shelbyville in those days. So I
You
tied
look
an
at
onion
this
to
human
my
from the
belt,
bottom. Does that remind
which
you
was
of
the
St.
style
Louis
at the
Arch? Have you
time.
been to St. Louis? And apes have a U-shaped arch.
Well, kinda. Among non-human extant apes, the dental arcade is boxy with a distinct angle from the canines, whereas in humans, the whole dental arcade is roughly parabolic. But interestingly, in animals like Australopithecus, we see an intermediate condition. The exact thing you'd expect if humans had evolved and Australopithecus was closer to humans than to other apes, but still retain many of the basal traits of other apes. This is just once again meant in saying that because humans are derived, they didn't evolve. But being derived is kind of what evolution does. So it's basically him saying humans are too evolved to have evolved. It really doesn't make any sense. Also, again, how parabolic does the dental arcade have to be before we say that the animal isn't an ape? Just like prognathism and orbit shape, this is something that comes closer and closer to the modern human condition as you look at various hominins through geologic time.
Now, there are humans that are more U-shaped than others, and there are apes that might have a slight width. But when you put all these things together that we've been talking about, believe me, you can pick out the apes from the humans.
No, all we've shown is that among extant apes plus one extinct hominin, the modern humans are easy to distinguish among those other apes. But that was never in question. It's not like scientists are going around mixing up humans and orangutans all the time. But similarly, among the animals that Menton does think are evolutionarily related, like lions and jaguars, people aren't really mixing them up either. Jaguars are unique among cats, so by Menton's logic, they must not be cats. But the problem is that all cat species are unique, as are all ape species. So unless he wants to go with species fixity and separate creation for each species, pointing out what makes a species unique doesn't do anything to remove it from the family it's evidently in.
In fact, let's just do that. Let's look at a group of genuine ape men. I mentioned Australopithecus sediba. Remember, that was the recent one that was found that is supposed to be very close to Homo? And on the left is Australopithecus sediba, and on the right is a human. Let's just apply the things we just learned. What about protruding nasal bones?
Well, Australopithecus sediba has a protruding nasal bone, so I guess it's a human.
Does Australopithecus sediba come through for us there?
Yep, just like the gorilla did.
I don't think so.
I mean, okay, that's great and all, but it has a noticeably raised nasal bone. Sure, it's not as extreme as in Homo sapiens, but it's still protruding. So are we going to introduce some actual metric for how much nasal bone sticky outiness counts?
Compared to the human. By the way, people say that Australopithecines have protruding nasal bones. Here's Lucy. What they're talking about is a little burr here, where the two nasal bones come together, just a little ridge. It is no protruding bone at all, but if your mind is biased towards making an ape into a monkey, then you make a big deal out of that ridge.
Okay, so the nasal bones protrude where the joint between the left and right nasal bones form. This results in a protrusion of the nasal bone. I don't know how to take this other than to say, yes, Australopithecus afarensis has a protruding nasal bone. Good to see that Menton is just lying to our faces and showing us that he's doing so.
Well, let's look at another feature of the skull.
Oh good, we're moving on without any quantifiable criteria for why nasal protrusion in Australopithecus doesn't count. Just some nuh-uh.
What about the slope of the face? You're looking at sediba on the left, human on the right. I think you can see the obvious slope on the face of sediba. So,
oh yes, I can. But funny how when you compare it to, say, a chimpanzee, it's intermediate between the human and the chimp. Almost as if we have a transitional species here. And you know what? Just because it's been a while, here's a slideshow that includes some hominins. That was fun. And heck, just because I can, here's Dr. Banjo acting just like David Menton.
I cannot speak for you, sir, but my ancestors were not monkeys. They were orangutans. Hard-working, patriotic orangutans.
Dr. Banjo?
In the fur. And I remind you that evolution is merely a theory, like gravity or the shape of the Earth. If your elitist East Coast evolution is real, why has no one found the missing link between modern humans and ancient apes?
We did find it. It's called Homo erectus.
Then you have proven my case, sir. For no one has found the link between apes and this Homo erectus.
Yes, they have. It's called Homo habilis.
Aha! But no one has found the missing link between ape and the so-called Homo habilis.
Yes, they have. It's called Australopithecus africanus.
Oh, I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius macilli? Answer me that, Professor.
Oh, okay, granted that one missing link is still missing. But just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Pshaw! Things don't exist simply because you believe in them. Thus saith the almighty creature in the sky!
That would be a trait that would certainly be considered very ape-like.
Interesting. So prognathism means that an animal is more ape-like. So I guess chimpanzees are more ape-like than Australopithecus sediba, and so A. sediba is more human-like than most of the other apes. Sounds like precisely what we would expect to find if humans indeed did evolve from apes.
What about the visibility of the orbits as viewed from the side? Can you look right in? Here again, it's much easier to see into the orbit of the curved forehead of the human.
Yeah, but once again, compared to a chimp skull, and you find that Australopithecus is intermediate between the basal ape condition and the derived human condition. Weird how this species, generally seen as transitional, keeps showing that its morphology is more human than that of other apes. It's almost like this is excellent evidence for human evolution and common ancestry with other apes.
Whereas Lucy's forehead, and this is not really so much a replica as a kind of a reconstruction of fossils that have been found called Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy for short. Flat forehead like any proper ape.
Yet again putting his hands over the orbits of the Australopithecus skull and not the forehead, while showing the forehead to the camera so we can all see that it is in fact curved. Good to see we're sticking with the blatant and obvious lies theme of the show. At least the lies weren't quite so obvious in the bird and dinosaur talk.
Round orbits like any proper ape.
So here's the skull of Lemur cata, the ring-tailed lemur. It has really round orbits. I guess maybe it's an ape. Except remember how last episode we went through the basic exercise to see if something is an ape? Yeah, it stops being in the same group after primate, so it's not even a monkey. Well, here's the skull of a Nycticebus, not sure which species, but it's a slow loris. Notice those extremely round orbits. But again, this isn't even a monkey, despite being a primate. Well, okay, let's look at something that is a monkey. Here's the skull of the Ontopithecus rosalia, the golden lion tamarin, which is personally one of my favorite monkeys. Sadly, they are absent from almost all of their original range, but are making a numerical recovery thanks to reintroduction and captive breeding programs. Anyway, look how round those orbits are. But still, these aren't old-world monkeys like apes. So let's head to the next. Here's a Semnopithecus skull. That is the skull of a langur. Notice how it too has round eye sockets, but it's still not an ape. So we now know that round eye sockets don't make one an ape. Many primates that aren't apes have round eye sockets. But perhaps all apes have round eye sockets, so it's still a useful metric for excluding humans from the apes. Well, here's a gorilla skull. Its orbits are actually the least round we've seen so far. If anything, they're less round than human orbits are. Are gorillas the real children of God made in his image? I'm not a theologian, but I'm betting that the surviving staff at AIG would probably say no. So perhaps since round orbits are found all over the primate order and are not universal to apes, with both genera gorilla and Homo having less than round orbits, this is a bad way to judge whether humans are apes.
No protruding nasal bone, no nasal spine.
Except that Menton already showed us the protruding nasal bone and just said it didn't count for reasons that don't make any sense, because they're also true of Homo sapiens nasal bones, at least as he described them. But also, let's remember that gorillas also often have protruding nasal bones. It's almost like Menton doesn't actually have any good reasons to show why humans aren't apes. Instead, he's just deciding that things that make humans unique among apes makes them not apes, but that isn't the case for the other apes. The huge size of gorillas and their extreme bite force and sagittal crests are hugely derived and very unusual among apes, but that's okay because he doesn't care about gorillas. They can stay apes. And on the other hand, the human weak bite force and funny dental arcade makes them not apes, for some reason.
U-shaped.
So interesting. Let's look at the maxillary and premaxillary teeth of the three taxa: Pan-troglodytes, Australopithecus afarensis, and Homo sapiens. First, note that the canines are reduced in Australopithecus compared to Pan-troglodytes, making them intermediate in canine size, but also notice that Pan-troglodytes has a gap or diastema between the incisors and the canines, whereas Australopithecus and Homo do not. Also notice that the row of incisors in the chimpanzee is straighter than in either the human or the Australopithecus. Now, in the shape of the row of the molars and premolars, the Australopithecus is nearly identical to the chimpanzee. It's almost like Australopithecus is a perfect transitional form, intermediate between basal Miocene apes and modern humans.
Big zygomatic arch here.
I still have no idea why the zygomatic arch or temporalis muscle size is a big deal. Once again, going back to gorillas, theirs is enormously bigger than all the other apes, and yet that doesn't exclude them from being apes, according to Benton. So why does the relatively small arch of humans exclude them? Oh, right, it's special pleading.
But notice the orbits of the eye are round, goggle-eyed. And from the side, you can hardly see into them because the forehead's flat.
I've already covered why all of that is stupid in some depth. I don't see a need to do so again. Just rewatch this video if you're not clear on why all of this is dishonest and dumb.
You sort of getting the hang of this? You think you're a little better prepared to go into a museum that purports to show human evolution and find your way through?
No.
What about the cranial capacity? Maybe Australopithecus sediba comes through there.
What does that even mean? Australopithecus sediba isn't a human, so there's no reason to expect it to have a cranial capacity within the human range.
And the cranial capacity for sediba is 400 cc's. That is, if you were to take the skull and you got this hole called the foramen magnum, and you were to pour, say, millet seed in there, and then dump it out into a graduated cylinder, you could see how many cc's fit to give you the capacity.
To the surprise of no one, two species of ape don't have the same cranial capacity, because no two species of ape do. Let's look at a chart of hominin cranial capacity. Hey look, you can find any capacity from 300 cubic centimeters all the way to about 1750, considerably higher than modern Homo sapiens in hominins. And there's a very noticeable tendency towards higher cranial capacity as you go forward in time. Almost like hominins were under directional selection for larger brains for a very long time. Interestingly, the low end of capacity for Homo habilis is within the high end of the range for Australopithecus africanus and A. afarensis, and the low end for Homo erectus. And the low end for Homo erectus is within the high end for Homo habilis, and the low end for Homo heidelbergensis is within the high end for Homo erectus, and the lower end for Homo sapiens is within the high end of H. heidelbergensis. It's like we have a transitional series for brain size with literally no gaps. Pick a cranial capacity between 400 and modern humans at 1400 or 1500, and you can find a hominin with that capacity, and at about the predicted point in time where it would make sense for the evolution of humans from more basal apes. Human evolution doesn't go from A. sediba directly to H. sapiens, and pointing out that they're not the same species does nothing to counter the mountains of evidence in favor of human evolution.
The old idea was big brains are smart, and little brains aren't so smart, so they made a big deal out of brain size among human beings. Turns out the cranial capacity of a human being ranges, the normal range is from about 700 cc's at the small end up to about 2 liter at the large end. and for a human male, about 1.4 or 1.5 liters. And there's no correlation between intelligence and body size.
Yep, human intelligence within the species is not correlated to cranial capacity, whether in absolute terms or scaled to be proportional with body size. But still, one of the major ways in which humans are derived compared to other primates is their enormous brain size. So it's important, if you want to argue for the evolution of humans from other primates, that you have some account of how their brains got to be the big monstrous globes of anxiety meat that they are today. Fortunately for all involved, the fossil record of hominins is full of apes of increasing cranial capacity.
Because women, on average, have a little bit smaller cranial capacity than men. And they're not less intelligent by any means, but their bodies, on average, are a little smaller. And so their cranial capacity. Cranial capacity normally will run with weight or size. The bigger the brain.
Also true. But there's another metric, called encephalization quotient, that scales brain size against body size to reveal how big the brain is proportionally. And in this too, hominins increase over time until we finally arrive at the modern encephalization quotient of Homo sapiens.
What about apes? They have about the same range of variability in size, from about 300 up to 500 cc's for an ape.
Well then, I guess Australopithecus africanus and afarensis weren't apes, given that they both have maximum cranial capacities closer to 600 cc's. So was Lucy not an ape and instead a human, just like those gorillas we saw earlier that according to Menton's criteria fit in with the humans rather than what he would call apes?
And again, it correlates with the size of the ape, with a gorilla having a really big brain compared to a chimp.
Yep. Not sure what the point is, though. Also, have you noticed that he still hasn't actually bothered to tell us what an ape is? At no point so far has he given us a way to look at any given animal and tell us with any confidence if it's an ape or not. It's like he was allergic to having a talk about classification in any way that's useful. Now, dear audience, tell me in the comments if you think that this is because David Menton was an idiot, a liar, or both.
But overall, we can say that the cranial capacity of a human is about 3 times the size of the average ape.
Well, only if you take humans out of the mix before you do the average, but let's try with mass and see if we can do the same thing to exclude gorillas from the apes. The average mass of an ape, including humans, but excluding gorillas, is about 67 1/3 kilograms. The average mass of a gorilla is about 220 kilograms. Wow, the gorilla is more than 3 1/4 times as massive as an ape. I guess they sure aren't apes. Or maybe we recognize that Menton is special pleading and that pointing out that one species of ape is the most extreme in some category, whether it be cranial capacity, bite force, or mass, doesn't actually do anything to remove that superlative species from the wider group. Some ape had to be the tallest, the shortest, the biggest brained, the smallest brained, the least massive, the most massive. Pointing out that some species happens to be the one at the extreme of the range of the family doesn't remove it from the family. And by and large, creationists know this. They don't go around saying that Paleoloxodon falconeri wasn't an elephant, despite only being a meter tall, when today elephants are 3 times as tall. They don't say that gorillas are just too heavy to be apes. But when it comes to humans, for some reason, having some extreme morphologies suddenly is of taxonomic significance in ways that it never is for the other animals. Of course, we know the reason, really. It's because the Bible, according to their interpretation, says that humans are the special boys of creation, and therefore must be a separate creation from anything else. So they come at the science with this conclusion already in mind, and they are not allowed to deviate from it no matter what the evidence actually shows. This is the opposite of how science is supposed to work, and it's why I maintain that creationism is not just pseudoscience, it's anti-science.
But it's the way the brain's put together that makes the big difference between humans and apes.
Now we're being introduced to yet another supposed characteristic of apes, brain architecture. No citation, no actual description yet of how that architecture is characteristic of apes, but absent in humans. But who knows, maybe we're about to launch into a long discussion of neurology, which is what we should do if he wants to make this argument.
Our ability for abstract thought and anticipating the future and what have you, and discussing the beauty of something. Obviously, no animal has done anything remotely like that.
So I would never dispute that humans have the highest capacity for abstract thought among the apes. But do other apes lack this capacity, or do they simply have a lesser capacity for it, the same way all apes have a lesser capacity for bite force than gorillas? Great apes of all kinds routinely pass one of the classic tests of self-awareness, the mirror test. If a spot of paint is put on the forehead of an ape, any ape, it is capable of recognizing this fact upon seeing itself in a reflective surface. We can tell because they see the spot of paint on the ape in the mirror, and then they reach for their own forehead to investigate the spot of paint. Compare this to the behavior of a dog or cat seeing itself in the mirror. As I think most people know, dogs and cats treat their reflections as other animals. They don't have the capacity to realize that the animal in the mirror is doing exactly what they do, and then using their imagination to realize that that animal is actually themselves, and they can examine their own body by looking in the mirror. Instead, they're stuck reacting to their own reflection like it's another dog or cat. This requires a significant amount of abstraction and imagination. But beyond this, apes have a theory of mind. They recognize not only that other members of their own species, but even members of other species, have their own perspective and may not have information that they themselves have. They can put themselves mentally in the shoes of another animal and imagine what its perspective would be like, and how that will likely influence that animal's behavior. I don't think we're anywhere close to chimpanzees writing the next great work of literature, but they certainly can think abstractly. They act in ways that in humans would be associated with curiosity, fear, anger, empathy, love, sadness, and shame. They can put themselves in the shoes of others in their imagination. They can recognize that they are a discrete entity in the environment and are curious even about their own bodies. Indeed, even other old world monkeys that are not apes have these capacities to some degree. Humans are different in degree, not kind.
So there again, I would say it's an ape, and overall, what would the conclusion be? Well, based on the skull, I'd say an ape.
I mean, yeah, literally no paleoanthropologist is suggesting that Australopithecus sediba is not an ape. It's very obviously an ape.
One of the most important pieces of evidence we could look for would be cultural artifacts. Apes just don't make tools.
Chimpanzees not only make tools, but they have their own archaeological record, because they make tools out of stone. The Ivory Coast has chimp stone tools going back to about where Menton thinks the flood was. And not just stones that have been touched by chimps, but ones that were modified to make them better tools. Granted, pen and tool use is very basic compared to hominin tool use, but it certainly exists. Further, with human guidance, bonobos, that is, Pan-Paniscus, can be trained to do things like start fires and roast marshmallows and help cook pasta, as is evidence in the bonobo known as kanzi.
And use them then to make other tools.
Wait, you need to make tools to count as human? Flint knapping, one of the most basic technologies ever used by humans, doesn't involve first creating a tool to make tools. You just use natural stones to start off with. So I guess if chimps were making stone axe heads, but they were doing it by knapping, with naturally occurring stones, that wouldn't count. That's arbitrary and obviously would exclude some members of Homo sapiens from being humans.
This is a feature of humans, and wherever you find proper human skeletons or fossils, usually sooner or later you'll find evidence of human habitation or hunting or cooking or artwork, what have you. We'll talk about that when we have a few specific examples.
I mean, yeah, human remains tend to be associated with human tools. But hey, we have chimp tools from the ancient past too. So this isn't really a distinction. Humans, once again, are just doing something more than the other apes, but other apes are still doing it.
So I would say overall, Australopithecus sediba strikes me as being an ape.
Well, yeah, no one disputes that. When the claim is that humans are apes, all their ape ancestors will be apes too.
And not related in any necessary way to humans.
Ah, I see. So their morphological intermediacy is just a happy coincidence. Weird how evolution predicted the existence of such transitional forms, not just for humans, but for all life. And hey, we found them! And far more than in just the human lineage. In fact, it's that time again.
Remember when I showed you the chart at the very beginning was Ardipithecus remitis? It was one of the first ones that separated, presumably, from those creatures that became apes.
No, it was already an ape. It separated from those apes that became chimpanzees and bonobos. It had already separated from the apes that would become gibbons, orangutans, and gorillas.
Take one look at the orbits of the eye there. What would you say we're looking at? Those shapes of those orbits are just screaming ape.
Unlike gorilla orbits, according to Menton.
The nose bones are flat. It's hard to see that when you're looking from the front. There is no nasal spine. But look at the width of the skull here. Right here, see here? And look at the width of the cheekbones. If we were put together in that proportion, I would have cheekbones out here someplace. And I'd have a massive zygomatic arch through which a huge temporalis muscle ran. So you see how powerful these little things are when you're looking for details? At least you can critically evaluate.
Yeah, you can critically evaluate and find that the earliest hominids are morphologically distinct from the later ones, H. sapiens included, which is, what's predicted by evolution. And in fact, you find that they are less derived, that is more morphologically similar to the ancestral Miocene apes than humans are. Which again is sort of the point. Basically, Menton is just saying that the transitional hominids are so transitional that they don't count. Evolution predicted them so perfectly that we should probably just ignore evolution. To turn the tables, it would be like if you could watch the resurrection of Jesus and then turned around and said, "See, I knew it. Christianity is completely wrong."
And the cranial capacity of Ardipithecus remitis was 300 cc's, which puts it at the small end of apes.
Yep, hominids were generally smaller in the past, and most lineages have become bigger over time. Even the bonobos would be fairly large compared to the apes of, say, 7 million years ago. But who is arguing that Ardipithecus wasn't an ape? Certainly not paleoanthropologists. Plus, we're not even actually being given a reason it is an ape. Because remember, Menton never mentioned any of those. He apparently didn't really care.
So I would conclude that Ardipithecus is an ape.
Hooray! He finally got to the same conclusion as literally everyone else.
What about Australopithecus africanus? We mentioned that. That was in the side chute. Some people believe it became extinct and went no further. Others believe no, it went on up to Australopithecus sediba. This is a juvenile. It happened that the first Australopithecine found was a juvenile. And I have a replica of a chimp skull in my office, and I have a replica of this fossil of Australopithecus africanus. It's very difficult to tell the two apart.
I'm not a human anatomist or a primatologist, but even I'm calling bullshit on this. Chimpanzees have much bigger brow ridges, they're much more prognathic, they have much larger canines, they have a gap between the top incisors and the top canines that allows the bottom canines to fit into place. A. africanus has a more parabolic shape to the anterior tooth row and a more ventral foramen magnum than chimpanzees. It also has a proportionally larger brain case, if not an absolutely larger one. If Menton can't tell these species apart, then I can't help but wonder how bad he was at his job of teaching anatomy.
They love to show this because the cranial size, look at the size of the brain relative to the face, that's quite large, but that's typical of the juveniles in primates in general.
That's why when I showed the skulls, I compared adults. Why didn't Menton? Is it so he could accuse his intellectual opponents of being misleading when in fact he's been demonstrably wrong about virtually everything this whole time? And if anyone is being misleading, it's him? Well, now that he's an ex-ape, I guess we can't ask him. But I can say, hey, don't be an idiot like an AIG PhD. Go get your shots.
The brain is larger at first because it develops early. Even in the embryo as we're growing and into the fetus, the brain's very precocious and grows very quickly. And the spinal cord, part of the central nervous system, grows very quickly. The rest of the body kind of catches up later.
Yep, that's why babies have such big old noggins. And also why baby humans look a lot more like baby chimps and gorillas than adult humans look like adult chimps or gorillas. But then again, that's in line with the ontological evidence for their shared common ancestry.
I guess it's because those particular features are needed earlier in development.
Maybe it's because the nervous system can't really afford to expend lots of energies on growth. I don't really know. I don't think it matters much to this discussion, though. And to be fair, I don't think Menton would have disagreed with me there, so I won't make it a big deal.
In any event, if you apply all the criteria we've talked about, I think we've got another ape on our hands here.
Yeah, but these are all going to be apes. And his criteria don't make them apes, because as we've seen, his criteria would also make many non-apes apes, and some clearly non-human apes like gorillas into humans. So his criteria are useless. But yes, I will keep saying it.
Now let's get to a creature they actually call a man, or a human. Nutcracker man. Have you heard of Nutcracker man?
I have. It's a common name. But notice that the actual name given is Paranthropus, which doesn't mean human. It means near human or next to human. So this isn't considered to be a human by anyone, by any definition of human I'm familiar with.
He goes by a lot of different names. Most popular one today is probably the one given, Paranthropus boisei.
The only other one that's a formal name that I'm aware of in the literature is Australopithecus boisei, which sure doesn't make it human. The genus Paranthropus is also not thought to be ancestral to genus Homo by anyone that I'm aware of, and as far as I can tell, never has been. Also, before he says it, yes, it was an ape.
Others called it Australopithecus boisei, and some call it Australopithecus, implying that it's very large, or gargantuan Australopithecus.
So the only other name is Australopithecus then. Not exactly many other names, but whatever.
Now, first of all, look at the top of the skull. You see this ridge here? You look at a male gorilla, you see the same thing. It's called a sagittal crest. It's right on top of the head here. And what's that for?
It's for anchoring large temporalis muscles.
A weather vane or something when the creature's walking? No, the temporalis muscle is so huge on this creature, while the skull is so small, there's not enough room on the skull to attach the temporalis muscle. So you have to have a big ridge on the top here. You can see a hint of it here, 2 little lines. That's where the temporalis muscle come together.
Gee, I wonder if that's what gave Paranthropus the nickname of Nutcracker Man, because of its giant jaw muscles that would have resulted in high bite force. It's almost like Paranthropus was adapted for a durophagous lifestyle, that is, eating tough things. You know, like nuts. Also, you see similar adaptations in gorillas, who, while they prefer softer foods, are perfectly willing and able to eat extremely tough foods when their preferred diet is not available.
But at some point, you have to have a plate up here. So if you were to tap a gorilla on the skull, any place off the center line, you'd be tapping an inch or 2 of muscle between your finger and the skull, all related to chewing. So talk about bite, they have that ability. And I guess that's why they called this creature Nutcracker Man, because they figured, boy, he'd really be good at cracking nuts.
But wait, if having an extremely huge brain takes humans outside of apes, why doesn't having extremely large temporalis muscles, even compared to other apes, not take both Paranthropus and gorilla outside of the apes? Could we be continuing to special plead? Perhaps.
Today, they're not even sure he ate nuts or anything else.
I could say with 100% confidence that Paranthropus ate nuts or anything else. That's what all animals eat.
Notice the zygomatic arch is huge, which you'd expect here.
Yep, so huge that it's way huger than normal for most apes. Probably not an ape by the type of logic Menton uses, so if he concludes that this is an ape, we'll know he's special pleading with humans all along, since Paranthropus is way outside the typical on this aspect of its anatomy compared to other apes.
The face is very sloped, no protruding nasal bones, and no nasal spine. Goggle-eyed, see the round goggle eyes. Again, an ape.
Actually, while it's true that Paranthropus doesn't really have a protruding nasal bone, it actually is only weakly prognathic, and is definitely intermediate between the prognathism found in other apes and that found in humans. This, along with its bipedality, is why it's considered a hominin. But notice that we're only given an anterior view, meaning that we can't easily determine how prognathic the face is. That's convenient. At least this time the lie is hidden better than it was in other parts of the talk. Menton did get a bit smarter here, if also more devious.
What about this one? Have you heard of him? Cro-Magnon man. Now, you can't just trust the word man when they throw it in, like they did with Nutcracker Man. I think it was an ape.
Hooray for special pleading!
Now, you can't just trust the word man when they throw it in, like they did with Nutcracker Man. I think it was an ape.
So does everyone else, and Cro-Magnon is just Homo sapiens.
As I understand anatomy. But what about Cro-Magnon man? We might begin by how big a cranial capacity? About 200 cc's more than most modern humans do have. So he's no lightweight when it comes to brain size. Look at the orbits of the eye. Are they round goggle eyes or are they more oval? It's really the more oval appearance, isn't it, right in here?
Ah, so like gorillas, it doesn't have the ape-shaped eyes, which, just to be clear, most non-ape primates have, making most primates apes, I guess? See how this just doesn't work?
And look at the nasal bones, how nicely they protrude. And the face is pretty much perpendicular to the zygomatic arch, which would be right in this area. It's broken, but it was right in here. Everything put together, curvature of the forehead, no question human, but for me, the real clincher comes from cultural evidence. We have loads of cultural evidence for Cro-Magnon man, tools and things of that nature.
Yes, we do. There's a reason that Cro-Magnon isn't used in the literature anymore. There's really no way to distinguish what was once called Cro-Magnon from just regular old Homo sapiens. And that's what they were. But let's check out our real criteria for apedom that isn't just a pile of obvious special pleading. We'll start with the plesiomorphic traits. Now if you want to go into these further, I suggest watching episode 1 of this series. They have vertebrae, 4 limbs. We can't say for sure about fingernails or a placenta, but given they're just humans, it would be pretty shocking if they didn't have those. They have enclosed orbits, so we know they're primates. Being Homo sapiens, they had noses with nostrils that opened down rather than to the side. We know they had the dental formula 2123. They have Y5 molars. They have a barrel-shaped chest, a ventral foramen magnum, extremely so in this case, as well as that super flexible shoulder joint. Looks like all the things that make apes apes are present in Cro-Magnon, and hence in Homo sapiens. So while I agree with the doctor that these are humans, which is also the general consensus, they are also, obviously, apes.
So, unquestionably human. You see, you can tell a difference.
What difference? The difference that makes them human? Sure you can, but that's not telling you that they aren't apes. We never actually got the criteria from Menton as to what an ape is. I had to supply that, and guess what? They meet all the criteria for apes. Granted, they don't meet the criteria for being chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, or gibbons, but the claim isn't that humans are the same species as those other extant apes, but that they all evolved from a common ape ancestor, and are all apes.
I'm not suggesting that there weren't humans who maybe even at the time of the flood particularly, who had very poor nutrition. We certainly see evidence of that in human fossils we find. Bones that were broken and rather massive bones to resist forces put on them. So,
if you know where he's going with this bit, put it in the comments because I don't have a clue.
You may find some skulls that are difficult to call, but then there are other things in the body to look at too. By and large, it's pretty easy to separate the apes from the humans.
Is it? Because I noticed that we went straight from Australopithecus and Paranthropus to Homo sapiens. We didn't touch on the vast majority of Homo, like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo georgicus, Homo ergaster, etc. You know, the ones that form a smooth transition right from Australopithecus to late and modern Homo. Weird, isn't it? Is it perhaps because if we touched on all of those, it might be too obvious that we can't simply draw some line in the middle of the hominids and say that one side is apes and the other side is non-ape humans? I mean, it's a well-known fact that even the same creationist on different days doesn't draw the line in the same place. Everyone at AIG should take after Kent in saying this.
What I believe is dumb.
So what are the 3 ways to make an ape man? Here you go, the whole purpose of the visit. First of all, you can combine fossils from apes and from humans, the 2 separate, ape and human, put them together, call it one individual, and you have an ape man.
Something that has literally never happened with one exception of no known fraud. Piltdown Man. And guess who discovered it was a fraud? Not creationists, it was the scaly evolutionist, atheist, baby-eating, godless scientists.
Now that could be done intentionally, of course, somebody who had a devious intent. Could very easily be done inadvertently because these fossils are usually scattered about and you're picking up pieces here and there. Lucy was picked up in 2 different years, picked up parts.
Gee, good thing that real paleontologists actually cared to document where the fossils were found in situ, and then later also to check the joints for matching articulation to avoid the possibility. You do that, and in most cases you can even tell how many individuals of the same species there are, even with fragmentary remains. Never mind how many species there are. Do people not think that real scientists have ever considered that there might be difficulties in their own field, and that those scientists might have actually come up with solutions to fix those potential problems?
Years, picked up parts to put together what became Lucy. And you can't tell in every case whether you've got more than one individual or only one, unless you get two bones that are, she'd only have one. You get two left arm bones up here, that would suggest two individuals.
If you have both ends of any joint, you can tell. And if there are only one or fewer skeletons worth of bone associated, then there's no reason to think that you just happen to find two separate specimens. And when I say an association, we're sometimes talking about partial articulation. So unless this was a human and an ape running at each other and colliding so hard that their skeletons combined, this is just not a plausible idea. Further, note how this is basically the only place we hear creationists complaining about this possibility. None of them are worried that maybe a sauropod find was actually two different sauropods of two different families that got jumbled up and associated with each other. Why is that? Well, of course it's because creationists don't really care much about most animals. They don't really care to say that some one particular species of sauropod is a distinct creation, the way they do with humans. But they also know that if all the hominin finds are authentic, then there's really no clear way to draw the line between apes and humans. So one of their only options is to say that the hominins are actually not real organisms. They're accidental chimeras. But you add to this the problem that none of the individual bones of these animals is just identical to humans or basal apes, but that each individual bone itself is a mosaic of derived and basal traits. And even if it were true that scientists had chimerical hominins, which it's almost certainly not, it still wouldn't help the creationists because they're still faced with individual bones that are just as transitional as the whole species when combined.
Now, another way to make an ape man is to find humans in the fossil record. They're very rare, but try to find something about them that you can say is ape-like.
Well, that's easy. Literally everything about a human is ape-like, because humans are just apes.
Okay. And so there you're taking a human demoting to an ape level.
That makes just as much sense as saying you're going to demote a human to a mammal level or a vertebrate level. These aren't ranks of awesomeness with humans sitting at the top. These are simple classifications to which humans obviously and demonstrably belong. Biologists aren't making a tier list of animal taxa, at least not as a serious scientific endeavor. This isn't Tier Zoo, it's an actual science that doesn't make value judgments, just tries to describe as accurately as possible the way things are, and then use theories to predict future data. And the fact that humans are apes, combined with the theory of evolution, does that handily.
And this is the most common of all. You find apes in the fossil record and you try to upscale them to say there's this or that feature that allows them to be promoted to being closer to humans or human.
I mean, yeah, that's how you know you've got a hominin. Traits like reduced canines, more parabolic tooth rows, terrestrial bipedality, increased brain size, the reduction in brow ridge size, etc. are all morphological indicators of being closer to humans than to non-human apes. And note that Minton hasn't really done anything to indicate that these animals don't have the intermediate traits. He's just found some arbitrary characteristics of modern ape sapiens that they lack, and then used special pleading to say that therefore they're not humans, which no one said they were, and that they're apes, which no one has disputed, and that therefore they're not evidence of evolution of humans among the apes, which does not follow in any way.
Let's look at all three, combining men and apes. That was done with Piltdown Man.
And never again.
That was a model that was widely sold. I had a faculty colleague at Washington University School of Medicine that had one of these on her desk.
Tell them stories that don't go anywhere. Like the time I caught the ferry over to Shelbyville. I needed a new
I think she was well aware, as we are today, that Piltdown Man was a hoax.
Which is what they called Shelbyville in those days. So I tied an onion to my belt, which was the style at the time. Now, to take the ferry.
We're not sure who did it. Everybody's got some ideas. There have been several books written on Piltdown
Pictures
Man.
of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 peas for a quarter, you'd say.
Gets its name from having been
we?
found in a
Oh,
quarry
yeah.
in Piltdown, England, not far really from Darwin's home. This was back in 1912 near Sussex, England, or in Sussex. I spoke at Sussex University some years ago. It's the only time I've had my life threatened while on the stage.
I don't believe him. I don't think that happened. If anyone has evidence that it did, please let me know.
They don't take too kindly to having Darwin critiqued at Sussex.
Is it that, or is it that they don't like being obviously lied to? It's probably a coincidence that the name Menton sounds like mendacious, but also might not be a coincidence.
They dated this Piltdown Man and were pretty confident that it would come out at 300,000 years.
Kind of. At the time, they did not have any reliable absolute clocks that worked well enough to measure the age of Piltdown Man in anything close to a direct manner, and instead, they were using opposing chronologies of when the Pleistocene started. There were long, short, and in-between chronologies, with the in-between ones being reasonably popular, and this is where the 300,000 year estimate for Piltdown Man comes from. This was based itself on where the fossil was reportedly found. But once real dating techniques were invented, it was found that the human skull was probably more like 800 years old, and the orangutan jaw was a bit younger than that. Of course, what people who were basing dates on mostly guesswork from rough stratigraphic estimates without the benefit of radioisotopic dating said about when things lived or occurred doesn't really matter much here in the year of our Lord 2023 when I'm writing this. Further, of course, Piltdown Man is not part of the modern scientific picture of human ancestry, specifically because it's known to have been a fraud. And even before that was conclusively demonstrated, it was on the outs of the scientific community because all the progress in hominin evolution was coming out of Africa, not England. If you want to say that part of the reason that the current scientific understanding of human ancestry is wrong is chimerical fake animals, you have to show that the actually currently accepted animals are chimerical, whether by fraud or mistake. Pointing to Piltdown Man doesn't do that. This isn't an argument. Further, since hoaxes apparently mean that something isn't true, let's look at some creationist hoaxes, like the Delk print, which was obviously carved and even other creationists don't take it seriously anymore, but which many of them used to tout as evidence of humans living alongside dinosaurs before the flood, and the Paluxy tracks contain the tracks of humans and dinosaurs running from the floodwaters. Or hey, how about in 1993 when creationists ran a whole documentary about the Ark having finally been found, except it was all a hoax by George Jamal to expose their sloppy fact-checking, and it was such an obvious fraud that the wood he gave the creationists claiming it came from the Ark was actually soaked in teriyaki sauce to age it, and still smelled of the sauce. If we're going to measure these ideas by hoaxes that have fooled their proponents, then creationism will not be coming out on top.
And anyone, of course, who would disagree with that would be dismissed as a science denier.
Not true. There was skepticism over the find from the start. For one thing, because it was found in a gravel pit, not the kind of place you'd normally find such a fossil.
So you got that figure in mind, 300,000 years? It turned out that the skull was in fact a human skull, one with a very large cranial capacity. And it was a modern skull, but by modern we don't mean 2020 or something like that. We're talking about a skull from probably the 13 or 1400s when the plagues went through Europe and wiped out, some say, over half the population. We're kind of familiar with plagues these days, aren't we? I used to give this lecture a few years ago and nobody thought too much about them. Now with COVID, we do think about it.
Well, maybe he should have thought about it more instead of working for an anti-vax organization than dying during said plague.
There were so many people who had died, there was no place to bury them. So they put people, bodies into caves and into culverts and quarries and any place they could find to put them. It's believed that the skull was that source. And then the mandible, the jawbone here, was from a very modern orangutan.
The sources I found actually say that the orangutan jaw was also pretty old, but I don't really see how that matters.
And it had some molars that came with it, that were part of it. And then it had a chimp canine tooth. So this was quite a collection.
It was remarked on early in the history of the fossil, before the fraud was even demonstrated, that the jaw was remarkably like that of an orangutan or chimp, which, flatly contradicts Menton's assertion that anyone who questioned the authenticity of the find was ostracized.
We had a human skull, orangutan molar, and chimp canine tooth. And guess what? I've got the whole gang here for you today to show you who was put together to make. First of all, here is a conception of what the skull might have looked like.
Cool, a reconstruction of a fake taxon. I'm not here to talk about Piltdown Man, since it has zero part to play in current paleoanthropology except as a cautionary tale. But hey, let's talk about a couple more frauds in creationism. What about the time Carl Baugh claimed that he had been raising piranha in a hyperbaric tank and that they grew to enormous size, even though what he actually had in his tank were ordinary-sized pacu, a related but distinct group of fish? Somehow, I don't think it's plausible that Carl didn't notice the difference between the herbivorous pacu and the voraciously carnivorous piranha when it came time for feeding his high-pressure fish. Hey, let's talk about the ichthyostones, which are known modern forgeries. The forger admitted as much and demonstrated his techniques on camera, yet still, creationists use their absurd, cartoonish, and inaccurate dinosaurs to say that humans and Mesozoic reptiles coexisted in pre-Columbian Peru. See what I mean when I say that creationists probably shouldn't be using credulity on fake fossil hoaxes as a big dig on science, given their own track record of accepting just about anything fake that even vaguely hints at their ideas being right, despite the obviousness of the hoaxes? It's this thing called projection. Anyway, we're skipping the whole discussion on Piltdown Man.
Well, I'm glad Piltdown Man's out of the way, and I think there could be many other examples where parts have been mixed with human and non-human parts, whether intentional or not.
Cool, but there's literally zero indication that that's true. So until creationists put in a whole lot more legwork on paleoanthropology, it's not something anyone needs to take seriously. Without evidence, this is on the same level as just saying that Satan put the fossils in the ground to test your faith.
What about making apes out of humans? That was done with Neanderthal man.
And, every human who ever lived, because humans are apes.
Before we even begin, let's just look at Neanderthal man's skull. I have a replica of a Neanderthal skull. It's not a generalized Neanderthal skull, it's a specific one. This particular one didn't have a mandible. But we have lots of Neanderthal skeletons, enough that every bone in the body can be accounted for, including this little tiny bone under here called the hyoid bone. Can't see it, the jaw's in the way.
Yep, as it stands now, the Neanderthal skeleton is extremely well known. Who wants to bet that he'll complain about early reconstructions of Neanderthal before it was so well known? As if science should be able to get everything right every time before the data even come in. And it's bad that science actually seeks to correct past ideas in light of evidence that those ideas do not match the data.
So, let's just apply our criteria that you learned. What about cranial capacity, first of all, compared to modern man? We're not going to do a measurement, just take a look. What would you say?
It's certainly bigger than Homo sapiens. Of course, as has already been pointed out, someone among the apes had to have the biggest brain, and while among extant apes, it's ape sapiens, in the past it was another species. Just like gorillas are the heaviest apes among living apes, but were in the past surpassed by Gigantopithecus. But do you think H. neanderthalensis had the actual characteristics used to set apes apart from other monkeys? Of course it did. And since we have yet to get a definition of ape from anyone but me, and my definition is actually in line with what real taxonomists look at when deciding if any animal is an ape, for the sake of this discussion at least, we can be well assured that no matter how much like modern humans Neanderthals were, they remained solidly within the ape category.
Bigger, same size, or smaller? Bigger, sure, bigger. That doesn't mean he was smarter, but we're not looking at an ape brain here. That's what I really want to get across.
What I want to get across is that in no way makes it not an ape brain.
For a big skull, what about the zygomatic arch? I can get 2 fingers, but not 3 in there.
Oh, so significantly bigger than when he couldn't get 2 of his sausage fingers through the human zygomatic. So it looks like even on his own criteria, at least in terms of zygomatic arches, it's not so clear that Neanderthals are humans or not.
When you're taking a little skull like this one, look at the size of that arch for a much smaller creature compared to the human. See the differences, how major they are.
I don't see that, in fact. They're considerably more similar than are the chimpanzees and H. sapiens zygomatic arch in terms of the size of the temporalis muscle, which they would allow. But again, the size of temporalis muscles is not used to diagnose membership in hominoidea by anyone outside the context of creationists, special pleading for humans not to be part of the group. Because as I've said, they need humans to be the special boys of creation.
What about the protruding nasal bones, you might say? Well, wait a minute, I notice that's a light color. That would be something they didn't find for this particular skull. Well, as I say, a lot of other fossils have been found of Neanderthal had a very nice protruding nasal bone. And look at that nasal spine. Why, you just couldn't get more perfect than that.
It's like Homo sapiens and H. neanderthalensis were sister species or something.
What about the slope of the face? Pretty much perpendicular to the cheekbone. The forehead is curved.
Oh, this time we're putting our hands across the top of the frontal bones and not the orbits like with the previous non-H. sapiens hominids. Good to know we're still being blatantly dishonest.
And the orbits are not goggle-type orbits. They're a little broader than tall.
Oh, like this gorilla, but unlike, say, this howler monkey skull. It's almost like orbit roundness is still a bad way to judge if a primate is an ape.
Everything on here, except for maybe the length of the skull, kind of a bun on the back here, and these brow ridges would be just typical human.
Gee, that's a funny way to say that Neanderthals are not simply modern humans.
But we have modern humans that have a more elongate skull, and we certainly have modern humans that have a distinct brow ridge, like the Australian Aboriginals.
But do we have any modern humans with the occipital bun mentioned, or that lack a chin like the Neanderthals? No, we don't. Also, Here's the skull of a native Australian. Those brow ridges are more prominent than in most modern humans, but are still substantially smaller than in a Neanderthal.
So, and lots of cultural artifacts, arguably even a cosmetics kit. They found a couple of scallop shells that had been hinged with burials of Neanderthals. And by the way, they appear to have had burial customs. Bodies were in positions consistent with intentional burying.
That has been disputed, but then modern humans have had a huge variety of funerary practices, ranging from cannibalism to cremation, ground burial to sky burial, etc. Not all of them would leave obvious paleontological evidence. So even if the evidence of Neanderthal burial ends up not indicating intentional burial, I don't actually think that makes Neanderthals less like modern humans, since that's not universal to modern humans.
But inside these scallop shells were pigments, different pigments, some of them kind of metallic pigments.
I don't think that there's any serious dispute that Neanderthals had a complex culture and a high degree of cognitive ability.
So lots of tools, artwork, you name it. But what did the evolutionists do with it?
Accept the evidence that Neanderthals were intelligent and sophisticated animals. Oh wait, he means what did scientists do before that evidence came in? Well, since the evidence wasn't in, they reached some wrong conclusions. But then they did that thing that science does, and that creationists don't do as a rule. Correct previous erroneous ideas in the light of new evidence.
That's supposed to be Neanderthal man. Now, you run into that fellow, you might be a little scared.
So this picture is from the middle of the last century, probably about 1960, but it seems that the exact date that it was painted is unclear. The clamshell that may have been used for cosmetic purposes was reported on in 2010. Just like I predicted, Menton is going to whine that people didn't have the ability to see the future when reconstructing Neanderthals.
It's pretty frightening. Even his wife over here is kind of frightening looking. Even the kids are ugly.
I don't know. I try not to judge other species on the basis of Homo sapiens' beauty standards, but whatever.
It was painted up to produce this more bestial looking human being.
Other than portraying them as hairy, I honestly don't see what makes this bestial. These animals are shown using tools, wearing clothes, cooperating together, having families. Now, given that Neanderthals spent tens of thousands of years in places like Europe, I'd say they probably had lighter skin than is depicted here. But is Menton saying that he thinks dark skin is bestial? I sure hope not, but it's the only thing other than hair that I can see that seems like an obviously questionable aspect of the portrayal of Neanderthals here. But don't worry, guys. There's only one human race, and AIG tells you so there's no chance they're secretly racist.
But we don't need to guess on Neanderthal. And by the way, they say they split off from humans about 700,000 years ago. Recent genetic studies have shown that they're well within the range of variability of modern humans.
Citation needed. There are no such studies at all. In fact, every single study that has been done on Neanderthal DNA has shown that they nest outside of modern human variability, and that they are a sister group to all extant humans. In fact, this is such a big problem that notable whiny bitch Nathaniel Jeanson has taken to pretending that Neanderthal genomic data is too degraded to take seriously. Of course, the problem with that is that if it were as degraded as he says, then the consensus genome couldn't actually be constructed, because the fragments of the Neanderthal genome would be too small to be reliably sequenced. But they can be. Menton is so wrong that even his own colleagues don't agree with him here. It's always fun when Answers in Genesis can't figure out its own positions on this. Menton says Neanderthals are actually inside Homo sapiens diversity. Every actual study says that they are not. Jeanson says that we can't know because the DNA is too degraded, which it's not. Pick a lane, Ken Ham.
And many evolutionists do consider Neanderthal to just simply be Homo sapiens.
Not in decades, and it was the genomic data that conclusively slammed the door shut on Neanderthals just being a subspecies of Homo sapiens.
By the way, show you how this becomes a game. One of the ways you can tell one skull from another is like this, is because it's printed right on the jaw here, right on the mandible. And I'll read it. Homo sapiens, ever heard of it? You think, well, it's just Homo sapiens. Subspecies Neanderthalensis.
Ooh, he got a skull replica before the genomic data came in, and as a result, the replica maker included a then reasonable label. But then science did what it does, and it took new data into account, finding that the designation is no longer reasonable. Apparently, learning more things means that the whole endeavor of science is stupid. Just accept that it's all magic and sit down.
So they put a subspecies in. Ours is Homo sapiens sapiens. Today, if you buy the same skull from the same company, Samso in Germany, that same skull will read Homo neanderthalensis.
Hooray for the advancement of knowledge.
So they have demoted Neanderthal to a different species.
Demoted? The only reason to use that language is that you're a chauvinist who thinks that all other species are lower than you simply by virtue of being other species. Science isn't here to tell you which species is the highest ranking. Putting Neanderthals in their own species isn't an indictment of their intrinsic worth as a group. It's an acknowledgement that they are a genetically and morphologically distinct group that is outside the morphological and genetic range of any other group.
I don't think there's enough difference to even consider it a racial difference.
Cool, everyone who looks at the data disagrees, and Menton was a known liar and idiot. And in case it comes up, don't bother telling me not to speak ill of the dead. I speak truthfully of the dead. If a person was a garbage person in life, that doesn't change in death. Menton spent his time at AIG misinforming people who trusted him, helping boost false medical information, and lying about anatomy. I don't care that he's dead, it doesn't change who he chose to be. I'm not happy he's dead, but I'm not going to pretend he was a good person. He demonstrably was not.
Okay, what does the whole body look like? On the right there, you see two views of Neanderthal man. One's straight forward and one is from the side. And there's a third Neanderthal specimen over to the left here. This one is included to show, see how the knees are bent? And over here, the knees are straight. That's a subtle thing. You visit a museum, you'd never notice this. You wouldn't think twice about what's going on. But let me just give you a quick little lesson on knees of apes versus humans. Probably never thought about it a lot.
Okay, my prediction, and keep in mind that while I do script these, I do it as I go, so I don't actually know what he's going to say for certain. But my prediction is that he's going to talk about the valgus condition of the human knee and not mention that Australopithecus had the same condition, despite him thinking that they're just apes.
When apes walk, check it out, they don't walk the way we do, even when they walk on two legs, and no ape can do more than about 30% of its walking on two legs.
Except for hominins.
Mostly they want to get down and be digitigrade.
I'm sorry, what? Digitigrade apes. Apes that walk up on their toes like a dog. There has never been any such thing. Did Menton, the anatomist, just not know what digitigrade means? See what I mean about him having been an idiot?
Apes can't straighten their legs out, so their knees are bent like this at all time. Make this a little experiment. The rest of your visit at the museum today, walk around with your knees just slightly bent. Don't worry, people know you were in my class, so it won't be a problem. A little bent. Boy, will you get tired. You'll just be begging to straighten those legs out.
Morphologically distinct organisms have different habitual modes of locomotion. More at 10.
That's one of the reasons apes don't walk very long on two legs. I mean, it requires a tremendous amount of effort because they can't straighten their knee. Here's a little experiment you can do too. Sit in a chair and then kick your feet out like you're going to put them on a footstool. If you're totally relaxed and you kick your feet out, your feet go from this position when they're down to pointing out. Have you noticed that? They point out a little bit. Even our footprints, don't they point out? Just a little bit, they're not parallel. It looks funny if you walk, I'll try this, with your toes straight forward, doesn't it? Our feet are just a little bit out. That sets a lock in the knee. Very quickly sets a lock. As a result, we can stand at attention for hours.
Okay, time for a public safety announcement. Do not stand at attention with your knees locked. That's how you pass out. I am an actual military veteran, and that's one of the first things that you learn about standing at attention.
Because our knees are locked. As soon as we bend our knee, ever have somebody while you're standing at attention sneak up behind you and clip you right behind the knee?
I wasn't at attention, but my knees were locked, and a sea turtle did it in Hawaii. Does that count?
You can go down like a ton of brick because they've unset the lock and you weren't ready. Think of it, when you're running, every time your leg straightens out for the next stride, that foot rotates outward about 5 degrees. And the turning is not at the ankle itself, but at the knee.
I don't want to pull out the Grandpa Simpson meme again, but let's get to a damn point.
So we have a little bit of movement right here at the knee. And so we're setting the lock, releasing the lock, setting it, releasing it as we're running. Well, our body's got so many things that are amazing. If we had a month, I couldn't even begin to exhaust things that are amazing about the human body.
He's exhausting me, and this video hasn't even run an hour, never mind a month.
Here's another piece of evidence that's interesting. You've heard of these forensic experts that can take a skeleton.
Oh, okay, he didn't bother to talk about how this differs from other hominins, in his opinion, which, would be sort of important to the point. I guess I'll do it for him. Here's an Australopithecus knee. Notice how the angle of the processes where it connects to the lower leg at the knee are at an angle so that for the knee to sit straight, it forces the femur to come in from the wider hips. This condition is called valgus, and it is an adaptation to habitual or obligatory bipedalism, because it allows the weight of the body to be directed straight down on the knee while only one leg is supporting the body, such as during a stride. If you find that knee, it's a definitive indication of a biped, and Australopithecus has that knee. If this is a factor that makes something human, then guess what? All the things science says are closer to humans than chimps have this human characteristic, including Australopithecus, Paranthropus, Ardipithecus, and early Homo.
This is a plastic skeleton, but if it were real, they could take a skeleton like this and flesh it out and give you some idea what it looked like when it was alive.
Yep, forensic reconstruction is pretty cool.
This is how they've identified murder victims and what have you.
Oh, suddenly forensic science, which is what AIG would call historical science, is good science. Weird how they like to cherry pick that.
Used to be very laborious. They would sort of make clay, and they knew the temporalis fit right in this red area, so they would attach it there. It would sort of add the muscles and then put a skin over. Now it's done with computers. There was a guy named Jay Matterns who did the reconstruction you're seeing before you now. On the left, a close-up, and the right, more of a body shot of the same individual. Would fit in today if he were dressed the same way. His body generally is identical. There are some distinctive features. I'll point out a few. The brow ridge.
Oh, distinctive features. Hey, that's the kind of thing a species has. Neat.
But we know Australian Aboriginals have those.
Not to nearly the same extent. But hey, why not just lie about modern groups of humans to prop up your absurd conspiracy theories about evolutionary biology and paleoanthropology?
A little bit lower forehead than we normally would see.
Yeah, because of the entirely different brain case shape, with H. sapiens having a globular brain and H. neanderthalensis having more of a lemon-shaped brain. That's kind of a big difference, and certainly not within the modern range of human diversity like Menton mentioned mendaciously.
People have a little bit higher forehead, but again, large cranial capacity made up for in the length of the skull.
That's true.
Based on the face and the body, as a human anatomist, I'd say indistinguishable from Homo sapiens.
Weird then how both species have a suite of both cranial and postcranial characteristics that define them such that, given sufficiently intact remains, there is no significant ambiguity about to which group a find belongs. And I mean, just look at these skeletons, dear audience. You tell me in the comments if you think these skeletons are indistinguishable.
And that is indeed what it is. Add that to a lot of cultural evidence, and we're pretty well home free on Neanderthal being a human.
I mean, if you want to have a broad definition of human, then sure. If you mean anatomically modern Homo sapiens, then absolutely not. And I suspect that that is what he actually meant, especially since he lied about Neanderthals being indistinguishable from modern humans, and being entirely within modern human diversity, both genetically and morphologically.
Probably lived at the time of the flood or so and got fossilized. Not very many humans got fossilized. Not many primates in general got fossilized.
Interestingly, no. Primates, parasitactyls, artiodactyls, rodents, bats, carnivorans, etc. You see, Andrew Snelling is the one who set the general consensus around the flood boundary for answers in Genesis, and he places the boundary at the end of the Cretaceous. So, interestingly, no modern mammal families are found in that alleged flood rock. This means that all the Neanderthals that have been found would, according to AIG, be post-flood, not pre-flood or mid-flood individuals. That means they have to be descended from one of Noah's sons. But the tricky thing is that when the Y chromosome of Neanderthals is sequenced, it's recovered as a sister lineage to all extant Homo sapiens Y chromosomes. But AIG themselves already have said that they have figured out which groups of human Y chromosomes come from each of Noah's sons, and that none of them are Neanderthal lineages. So unless Noah had a secret cousin or something who snuck on the ark, this just doesn't work. I can't make this clear enough. The bare existence of Neanderthals on its own precludes the entirety of Nathaniel Jeanson's attempts to find support for the Bible in the human genome. And they do this regardless of whether or not Neanderthals are in the same species as modern humans, which again, they're not.
In the flood. What about that brow ridge, though? Does that kind of bother you a bit?
No. What about a prominent brow ridge should bother anyone?
Let me show you another Neanderthal. We've got so many, they have boys and girls and adults, different ages.
And the existence of so many Neanderthal individuals that have been examined by paleoanthropologists means that we have lots of data to make the conclusion that H. neanderthalensis is not a variety of H. sapiens.
Here's, I think, a 13 or 14-year-old Neanderthal girl that was fleshed out from the skeleton. If she were sitting in here today, would I notice anything unusual? She might have run a comb through her hair or something like that. You know, I've looked at that picture, and the only thing I can see that might get a little bit of attention is the lips are a little full.
The lack of a chin might give it away too, but also remember that juveniles of all apes look more similar to each other than do the adult forms. Pointing this out with H. sapiens and H. neanderthalensis doesn't really do anything to tell us how distinct they are. We already know that they're extremely closely related, and so we'd expect their children to be even more similar than the already very similar but still distinct adults. Further, if the children were indistinguishable, as Menton seems to imply, then how did this girl get identified as a Neanderthal? She must have been distinct in order to get that designation.
But do we have lip bones so we can look at bones and decide how big the lip should be?
No, but we do have muscle attachment points for the lips on the skull, so we still have a good way to estimate how big lips would be. But I also don't really think that the lips are as big a deal as, say, having an occipital bun or not having a chin, which would also set this girl apart.
I mean, if I were to tell you, boy, you should have seen this guy when he was alive, the lips were out here, you'd have no way of disproving it except to say that's pretty unlikely.
Or, you know, looking at the muscle attachment points. But hey, who cares about human anatomy when you're a human anatomist?
So you really can't... they had to put something in to make her look a little different. And I might notice that deer hide dress she has there. That's kind of unusual.
So we won't actually look at any significant anatomical differences between modern humans and Neanderthals that might be evident in this juvenile female Neanderthal. Thanks for wasting my damn time, Menton.
Okay, what about making men out of apes? Here is an ape, Australopithecus afarensis. We've already looked at the skull. All of its features, huge zygomatic arch, sloped face, flat forehead, everything.
But not that foramen magnum. That's intermediate between modern humans and basal apes, and that demonstrates, on its own, without the pelvis or knees, that Australopithecus, as a genus, was bipedal. Let's not talk about that, though.
This is an ape.
Still true, still uncontested.
The hips are ape-like.
Interestingly, here's an Australopithecus hip, a pan hip, and a human hip. While they're all certainly ape hips, it's pretty obvious which two are the most similar, and it's not pan on Australopithecus.
And there are many other features, too.
Yes, being a whole organism, Australopithecus afarensis sure did have many features.
So where did it come from? It was discovered by a team led by Donald Johanson in Ethiopia back in 1974. And it has been dated at 3 million years old, but there have been all kinds of dates all over the place.
Interesting. I'm sure we're about to get some examples of those data, complete with citations for studies that came up with them, right?
On Lucy, I don't accept the dates at all.
Well, this series is already going to be long enough. I don't think we have time to do a whole section on dating techniques.
But remember, the 3 million is going to fit into something a little later.
Okay.
What did this fossil consist of? As they say, it took 2 years to find all the parts. It's about a 40% complete skeleton, they say, but I've counted the bones, and I come closer to 20% than 40, but we'll go with 40.
Gee, sounds to me like someone has forgotten about the fact that apes are bilaterally symmetrical.
It's lacking nearly all the foot and hand bones. There are a few. The skull and the jaw are very primitive, even by ape standards. In St. Louis, I lived there for a number of years while on the faculty of Washington University School of Medicine. They had an exhibit there called the Living World exhibit. There was nothing alive in it. It was all models and what have you. And they had this, what they said was a replica or a model of Lucy.
Well, it's definitely not a replica, because that would mean you'd have the bones. This is clearly a reconstruction. Also, incoming lie about whether or not any non-human apes have white sclerae.
First of all, you realize, I think I've already mentioned, but Lucy was only 3 foot 7 inches tall. Down in here. It'd be like a small chimp. And yet, when they make models, they usually make them bigger, so it looks more like a human being.
Maybe, but I don't see a scale bar, so how can I tell?
And I used to get a kick out of looking at this model and watching other people respond to it. Children would come through, and they'd say, "Oh, look, an ape man," and the teacher would say, "No, that's an ape woman."
That sounds like something that never happened. I can't remember ever hearing a kid use the term ape man. Further, that use of man is not gendered, it's like mankind. It includes women. This use of man derives from the Old English word man with two N's. It just means human. Werman and withman mean man and woman respectively in Old English. And you can see wer, which also shows up in werewolf, and is related to the Latin word for man as opposed to woman, vir. As a result of sound changes in English, man and werman ended up being pronounced the same, and withman became woman. While in the early 21st century it is increasingly unpopular to use the word man in a gender-neutral context, this was not the case in the 19th century when the ideas that would be incorporated into the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology were first being bandied about. That's why Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, was about the descent of Homo sapiens, not just the men among them, as if women had a different line of descent. You can't simply look at a language synchronically as it is spoken now, and then apply that analysis to the past. That's why diachronic approaches to linguistics exist. Anyway, enough ranting about the development of the English language in terms of gendered terms for humans.
It was basically an ape head, if you look at it.
We're still ignoring the foramen magnum of Australopithecus. Fun times.
On a human female body, albeit a very hairy one.
Not really. The shape of the rib cage is different, the phalanges are more curved, and while I can't tell in this reconstruction, we know that while Australopithecus has the same 3 curves to the sole of the foot as the modern human, they were shaped differently. But yeah, I guess at a casual glance, if you don't pay attention to the anatomy, you know, like an anatomist might, then it basically looks like the body of a woman with hypertrichosis.
What is human like? The trunk, the breast, the genitalia?
Hey look, here's a picture of a female bonobo stretching. That's an animal that's far less like a human than Australopithecus afarensis, and yet it has a very human-looking body. To the point that I know people who find this picture of a wild animal doing wild animal things indecent on grounds of nudity. Now, I will say that the Lucy reconstruction is probably more human in terms of genitalia than many modern apes, and yes, that's speculative, but somehow I don't think that too many people are convinced of human evolution by staring at the crotch of a model of an ape in a museum. Also, if they were reconstructed more like chimp genitalia, it would be equally speculative.
The arms and hands, the legs and feet, the posture and gait.
All of which are minimally speculative, because we have other finds than just Lucy to base them on. And that's how they would have looked in life. I'm sorry that for some reason creationists don't like how human the postcranial skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis is, but that doesn't change it. It is how it is, and how it is extremely human.
I mean, look at that pensive gaze that she has. Do you have any idea what she's doing?
I don't know, probably the same thing as this pensive-looking real-life chimpanzee.
She's thinking. You see how an artist can work something like that in?
Thinking is kind of a big thing apes do, human and otherwise.
And then look at this close-up of the skull. I'm going to give you one more feature that isn't something you're going to see in a bony fossil. The whites of the eyes. Do you see the white part of the eye up there?
Called it.
There are no apes that have a white sclera.
Except for these that I found with a single Google search on the first page. Thanks for being such liars that you don't even think to check, young Earth creationists. And look, I know it's not like every last one of you, but hey, just like with the cops, if you want to convince me you're not a whole sack of dishonesty wrapped in a bow of scamming tied up with a knot of motivated reasoning, then work on cleaning house. Now I want to be fair, Peter from Paleologos indeed has called this lie out before, and he's a young Earth creationist. So some of them are trying, but he's still the only one I know of, so percentage-wise it's way over 99% who just don't care. Hey, if you happen to be a creationist, let me know in the comments how you feel about the fact that professional creationists keep making this very obviously wrong talking point one of their arguments that science is a liar sometimes.
I won't change my mind on anything, regardless of the facts that are set out before me. Science is a liar sometimes.
All humans have some shade of white sclera. So we don't see this in the fossil record. The eyeballs aren't preserved, just the orbits.
Generally true, at least for vertebrates.
But I get a kick out of how the artists always put some nice whites in the eye, and it gives you kind of a little message. Oh my goodness, human.
While humans are unique in being the only apes where white sclera has essentially fixed in the population, this trait is not unique to humans and is found in all apes. Given that there's ample evidence of human evolution, this trait must have fixed at some point in the past. Where is impossible to say. Maybe it was at or before Australopithecus evolved. Maybe not.
And look at those hands. They're just beautiful human hands in this model. The finger bones are nice and straight, just the way ours are.
I'm not actually sure that's true. Those fingers are covered in a lot of soft tissue that obscures the actual shape of the underlying bone.
The whole hand is a clearly human-like one. But research was done by a group, Sussman and Stern, in which they looked at the curvature of the fingers. We humans have straightish, not completely straight, but mostly straight fingers.
I just want to point out that the curvature of fingers is a very plastic trait. Chimpanzees raised in captivity with little opportunity to climb have straighter fingers, and humans who spend a lot of time doing things like gymnastics have more curved fingers. It's not really a good way to determine relationships on its own, but it's a decent way to determine lifestyle.
And apes have highly curved fingers because they're suspensory adapted to hang on limbs, okay?
No, not okay, because as I just stated, it's highly variable, which also is seen in the graphic Menton used himself, where there was a wide range with much overlap.
So what Stern and Sussman did is they compared this finger, this finger, this finger, and this finger with the fingers of Lucy. Now I say Lucy, there's more than one specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, so we can fill in missing bones from other specimens. The finger bones of Lucy are charted here as compared to living apes. These are living apes, the bonobo, the chimp, the gorilla, and then compared to human. And then this is Lucy down here, or an Australopithecine. The left means straight fingers, something in this area. Over here means highly curved. So as you go to the right, it's more curved. The data came out this way. Humans fell in that range where you see the little yellow bars. So curvature's in this range down here. And Lucy, or creatures like Lucy, not only have curved fingers, but for the most part, they were highly curved even compared to other living apes.
Yep, Australopithecus can certainly still spend a lot of time in the trees and was well adapted to life in such trees. I don't know why this is a problem for human evolution.
So this is not a human hand the way they show it.
No one is saying that a non-human had human hands, even if some artist potentially made the fingers on such an animal too straight, and I'm not sure that happened either.
To make matters worse, a few years later, back in 2000, Richmond and Strait discovered that Lucy had wrists that appeared to be capable of locking during knuckle walking.
Too bad her skull, spine, knees, hip, overall limb proportions, and feet are all consistent with bipedalism. Let me be clear. It is biologically and biomechanically impossible for Lucy to be a knuckle walker. Australopithecus is as definitive a biped as a human is. There is no debate about this, and the only attempts to argue otherwise involve simply lying about Australopithecus anatomy.
That's how you can tell a knuckle walker, not only from the knuckles itself, but the bones of the wrist can cluster together in a certain way that locks the wrist. If we tried to walk on our knuckles, we'd be down on our palms very quickly. We could walk flat on our hand maybe, but not like this. So it requires a very specialized wrist. Lucy appeared to have that. And so here at the Creation Museum, we made a model of Lucy. Ours is 3.5 feet tall.
And it has arms that are too long and a hip that's the wrong shape, and feet that are the wrong shape. See? It's just actual lying.
And we don't know what the hair looked like, but we think that's a fair guess.
I agree. The hair is a fair guess.
We show a hologram showing the humerus and the radius and ulna inside the arm, but we show her as a knuckle walker.
Which is a demonstrably wrong reconstruction, which is why no one who actually publishes in paleoanthropology takes it seriously, including Todd Woods, a young Earth creationist.
It's kind of funny, we had a bunch of pictures for a while down below here, and they were from museums all over the world that had produced models of Lucy.
Were they taken out because it was awkward to have so many better and actually honest reconstructions visible with the AIG lie?
And everyone was different. So we just told people if they didn't like ours, pick one.
Well, yeah, any two reconstructions of the same paleotaxon will vary, because some of it will, of necessity, be speculative.
And what about the feet? They show the feet being basically like hairy human feet. But Lucy didn't have feet like that, going back to Stern and Sussman. The curvature of human toes falls to the left on this graph, which means relatively straighter. And the curvature of the same toes for Lucy are further to the right, and if you'll notice, highly curved, even compared to ape standards, the blue in the middle, modern ape standards.
Cool, but we still know from both ichnofossils like the Laetoli prints and actual preserved skeletal elements such as the foot of Dakika child, that in overall shape and function, the feet of Australopithecus were closer to those of modern humans, and by a lot, than to the feet of other extant apes.
Well, it's fun to see what the popular literature does with all these evolutionary discoveries. There's a magazine called Discover, maybe you're familiar with it. Years ago, they had an issue called Hominid Walking, and it's supposed to tell us all about how humans learned to walk when they were still Australopithecines. The dark bones basically are based on the fossil itself, and the light areas are interpreted pieces. So you notice there was a piece missing out of the middle of the femur. What's interesting is the foot is absolutely human. Let's look at a higher power view of this. Notice the feet are entirely made up of imagination here. There's no brown in here. These are just fabricated feet.
That's obviously depicting the actual Lucy find, not just all the known material from her species. But as Menton himself mentioned, we have other individuals from whom we can pull information, and that's what this is made from. And yes, we know based on the actual bones that Australopithecus had an inline big toe and foot arches like those of humans that allow and require upright locomotion.
Based on just a few toes and what have you that have been found.
Parts of all the toes have been found, and in some cases in articulation. This is not just speculative in the way Menton insinuates.
Look at the hands. They got the hands right. It took until the year 1996 to get them right, but they got them right finally. And this is the way the Lucy skeleton would look if indeed it could walk in a bipedal manner.
As it must, based on every relevant bit of anatomy, including the valgus knee, the shape of the pelvis, the position and angle of the foramen magnum, the shape of the lumbar vertebrae, the shape of the feet, and the proportions of limbs, all of which are exclusively consistent with bipedality as the mode of terrestrial locomotion.
What about those feet? Why did they put human feet on Lucy when we know she didn't have feet like that?
Other than perhaps having toe bones that are too straight, we actually know she did have feet like that.
Well, it's all based on some footprints that are found at least 1,000 miles away.
No, they're also based on actual bones.
In Lotoli, Tanzania. And here's a picture of the footprints on the right. It was a long trail. It was discovered in 1972 by Mary Leakey, wife of Louis Leakey, both of them being anthropologists.
Paleoanthropologists. Are creationists allergic to that word or something?
And it was found in Lotoli, Tanzania, which, as they say, is a long, long ways from Africa, where Lucy was found.
What continent is Tanzania in again? Oh, right, Africa. But anyway, many animals have extensive ranges that cover many thousands of miles.
And yet they insist a creature like Lucy made these footprints.
Well, the tracks are inconsistent with modern humans in terms of stratigraphic position, size, and biomechanics, but they're consistent for all of those things with Australopithecus. So yeah, that checks out.
And to hammer that point home, they went down to Lotoli, Tanzania, hunted around in bone boxes of evolutionists and what have you, and found a couple of bones that they declared to be Lucy, or Australopithecus afarensis, and that's actually the type specimen for Lucy, not Lucy herself. So all kinds of efforts made to sell a story.
That's literally just a complaint that the most famous specimen of Australopithecus afarensis isn't the type specimen. Who cares? That's not an argument about anything. That's just whining.
This trail here is quite long. It is supposed to be 3.66 million years old. Remember, Lucy was 3 million. This is 366. So these dates mean nothing. I mean, they're arbitrary.
They're not. They're extremely well supported. And when creationists tried their hardest to find reasons to reject radiometric dating in the RATE project, they failed miserably and had to invoke magic. Basically, physics mandates that radiometric dating works. So their conclusion was that physics must have just not worked in the past.
Lucy's had dates all over the map.
But Menton didn't really feel like sharing them.
The trail is 73 feet long, and it consists of 20 larger footprints. We're not talking giant footprints. Footprints smaller than mine, but still pretty good size. Believed to be an adult. And you don't just have one footprint. You have the left-right stride, 20 of the larger footprints in a left-right stride, next to which are 27 smaller footprints. If you look carefully, you can see here's the large one, here's the left foot, and there's the right. You can see the stride is this long. Look at the children over here that are smaller. Here's the left foot, or the right foot. Here's the left foot. Notice we're pointing out at the angle, so it's got the knee lock. See how you can use this kind of information to critique things like this? I know there's a knee lock there.
Wow, the knee must have been valgus. You know, like the knee of Australopithecus afarensis.
The toe is pointing out, and indistinguishable from modern human feet.
Oh hey, those tracks are indistinguishable from human tracks, huh? Well, here's Dapper from the past to address that. Nope, Lucy was known almost immediately after being found to be bipedal. Although not exactly how good at being bipedal she was. The Laetoli footprints we're being shown weren't discovered for another few years. Plus, the Laetoli footprints are in fact not identical to modern human footprints. For one thing, they're small. For another thing, they are considerably more flat-footed than modern human footprints. But hey, don't believe me, check out Raiklin et al. 2010, which is linked in the description, and which has some really neat 3D analysis of the footprints compared to other footprints, including those of modern humans, which allows a careful analysis of the biomechanics, which shows that while the animals that made the track certainly walked in a very similar fashion to modern humans, it was not identical. And the thing is, I could have picked dozens of papers that all have a similar conclusion. The Laetoli footprints are human-like, and enough so to fool a layperson into thinking they just are Homo sapiens tracks. But closer examination shows interesting differences, which incidentally makes the tracks intermediate between humans and other apes who sometimes will walk on only 2 feet.
I heard Mary Leakey give a lecture on this shortly after she found it. She gave a lecture at Washington University, and she just didn't know how to explain this at all. These were way too early to have modern human feet.
They're not even as old as Ardipithecus, another bipedal ape.
She was not convinced that Lucy made footprints like this. It was some other creature not yet found that would be appropriate for 3.66 million years old, 3.66. Be pretty ape-like according to evolutionists at that point.
Yes, in that all hominins are apes. This is the foot of Child, a juvenile Australopithecus afarensis. Fun how the bones are all in a row, isn't it? It looks a lot like the kind of foot that would be able to make the Laetoli footprints.
But obviously modern-type human feet. The child increased stride to keep up with the bigger individual. What's really amazing, let's blow this up a little bit, one of these feet. Here's one of the footprints. On top of each of the big footprints is an even smaller footprint. So it appears to have been 2 children walking with an adult. The middle, or the bigger of the 2 children was increasing its stride to keep up, and the other child appeared to be stepping in the footprints of the adult. And Mary was generally puzzled by this, Mary Leakey. She said she just couldn't explain it. She mentioned that children do walk in their elders' footprints, but of course she doesn't want to believe that it's a human at all. But all of the features of a human footprint are here.
Funny, because White and Sua 1987 is a meta-analysis of the then-existing literature on Laetoli, and while they note that there was not yet a consensus about the prints, every single author in the field had noticed they were not anatomically consistent with identification of Homo sapiens. Weird that, isn't it? Again, there's a link to the sources in the description.
The big toe goes out and is in line with the rest of the foot, and then the small toes cling to the ground here, and there's a well-developed arch in this area right here, not flat feet by any means. And when we walk, the weight is distributed like this. It starts at the heel, goes on the outside of the foot, this is a right foot, and then it has a transverse arch. The weight goes over to the inner part of the foot, and we push off with our big toe. So with Lucy, we not only have human-shaped feet, we have the human stride.
Yeah. Hence why her genus is seen as related more closely to humans than other apes. Thanks for making my point for me, anatomy man.
I believe that the fossil footprints have nothing to do with Lucy.
Weird how you just said the opposite then.
That they're human, 100% human.
This time, Raiklin et al. 2008. Of course, there's a link in the description. Raiklin and company concluded that in order to get reasonable walking speeds, certain aspects of the gait had to have similarities to chimpanzee bipedal gaits, meaning that the footprints are, once again, not simply modern human prints. How about Hatala et al. 2016, which concluded the prints were made by something that was more similar to a human, but still significantly different from either human or modern chimpanzee? How about we take a look at Tuttle et al. 1991, who show that while there is some overlap in proportion with always unshot human footprints, the footprints fall outside the range of human footprints for the most part, and indeed are intermediate. Weird how Meldrum et al. 2011 reports that the Laetoli footprints reveal some midfoot flexibility and a different arch structure to that of modern humans. Of course, link is in the description.
Probably from the time of the flood.
Not according to the AIG geology bigwig. All of the Cenozoic is post-flood according to AIG, and this is really high up in the Cenozoic.
And that nobody's ever seen a footprint of Lucy, not ever.
Yay for question begging.
In case you're confused, this is ape feet versus human feet.
And here's the foot of Australopithecus showing an inline big toe. Fun times.
Well, there's so many things I could get into here. Let's talk about the hips.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to talk about the fact that the knee of Lucy is obviously valgus.
Lucy has ape hips, and what's the difference between ape hips and human hips, and why is that important?
Nothing. Human hips are ape hips. The question is, does Lucy have biped or quadruped hips? And the answer is definitively biped.
The left is the human hip bone, the whole group that we call the pelvis. You can see the bones that are underneath our belt here, the ilia. They are right here. And notice the difference between an ape on the left and a human on the right. The iliac blades of the human, instead of sticking out like this, wrap around the side. They come more than 180 degrees. They actually start to turn in. And you can see that in this model up here. These hip bones wrap around. In an ape, they would stick straight out.
In a quadrupedal ape.
Both sides. Why is that important?
Locomotion.
If you have ape hips, you cannot walk the way a human walks. You have to have human hips to walk the way we do. Oh, well, now we're going to have some fun. Here's a chimp, and that is what we call ape hips. These bones sticking straight out. Look at the human from a similar view, and they wrap around. Why is this important? Well, on the side, you can see the paint mark here. That represents where muscles attach. There's a spot right here where a muscle called the gluteus medius attaches. You've heard of the gluteus maximus. You're sitting on it right now. What does the gluteus medius do? It attaches right there, right where you see the red paint, or look up at the chart here, you can see it. And the muscle goes down to our thigh bone down here and attaches to a bump here called a greater trochanter. So let's put that muscle in. Notice it's fan-shaped. That's important. What does that muscle do? It abducts the leg. So it does this. But because it's fan-shaped, it can go out this way, it can go this way, or it can go to the front. What does that do for us? When we pick up our left foot to make a step, our hip ought to drop like a ton of brake. These are ball socket joints, aren't they? Which way do ball socket joints go? Any old way. When we lift our left leg, what keeps this from happening? When we lift our left leg, the right gluteus medius tightens up just enough so that we don't abduct the leg, we just keep it steady where it is. So you see, we can walk like this. We just have to remember to tighten up our gluteus medius on the opposite side we're lifting our foot.
Finally, a section I have nothing really to complain about.
We don't have to remember that. It's all automatic. Works perfect. What about an ape? Ape has all the same bones. There it is, the hip bones. And it has a gluteus medius. And the gluteus medius attaches right there. And it goes down to this bump on the hip bone, same as us. We call it homology. But it has a completely different function. It goes down the back, not the side. That means it cannot stabilize the hip for a monkey when they lift their foot. What it does, monkey has a posture, bent knee, forward like this. It keeps the monkey from falling on its face by rocking the body back. You say, well, we've got a problem here now. How is an ape ever going to walk on two legs?
By evolving a more lateral-facing iliac crest. It's not really all that complicated. And hey, Lucy has that condition.
If it doesn't have a muscle to stabilize the hip when it lifts each foot.
It does. It's still the gluteus medius. It's just that in some apes, it doesn't work as well.
Easy. Just watch the next ape. They'll teach you. When they lift their left foot, they throw their weight over the right. And when they lift the right foot, they throw their weight over the left, so this is the way they walk, right? You now know where the ape walk came from and why the ape walks with an ape walk. That's why the hips are so important. What do evolutionists do about
the
this?
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea.
Hip.
We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't.
She had the straight out bones.
Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human.
which remember was suspicious because her knees were those of a biped, so taking things at face value led to an animal that couldn't walk on 4 or 2 legs.
But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization.
So he's saying Lucy obviously had the same type of hips as we do. It's just that something broke it or distorted it.
A fact that is actually visible in the video Menton himself is playing.
So as you'll see in the next picture, someone is proposing it was a deer stepping on it, crunched it, and made it go from this to that.
More likely a bovid, since this is happening in a place with lots of bovits and basically no cervids.
What you're about to see is amazing. You're going to hear this particular anthropologist say that that the pieces fit together so well on Lucy's hip that they're impossible. And as a human anatomist, I never figured that out. How can something fit together so well it's impossible?
As a human anatomist, he never figured out that a bone-to-bone contact was a bad thing. Bones have cushions of cartilage. They shouldn't be in perfect contact bone-to-bone. That's pretty basic. Bones either fuse or they have soft tissue buffering the interface between them. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the reason Menton never figured this out is that he wanted to be silly, even though it's actually pretty obvious.
But he's going to say that, and he then makes it so it doesn't fit together well with a drilling tool or a saw. Here it is. You're going to get the crunch. That's the deer stepping
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
Break out the Dremel tool. Parts flying
Lovejoy
across
decided
the room.
he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape.
Notice he's
He didn't
removing
want to tamper
material,
with
not
the
just
original,
cutting.
so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
And still flat.
The lie detector determined that was a lie.
It's still flat.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Well, it's making your own data.
Here's a fun thing. As they were found, the hips of Lucy wouldn't actually meet in the middle at the pubic bones. The pubic symphysis was dislocated. Lucy couldn't walk on a hip like that, no matter how many limbs she walked on. So Menton's argument is that it's more plausible that Lucy walked on a broken hip that couldn't support weight than that perhaps there was some post-mortem damage, which there obviously was, given the obviously real breaks evident to even a layperson just looking at the hip.
I think I'll conclude by giving you the last word from an evolutionist, Dr. David Pilbeam, who was anthropologist at Harvard University for a number of years. He reviewed a book that Richard Leakey had written in which he had questioned all of the interpretation of human and ape fossils up to his time and said that a fossil he had found really had to change the way we thought about human evolution. It still occurred, but in a different way. And after reading this book, this was part of Pilbeam's review. Perhaps generations of students of human evolution, including myself, have been flailing about in the dark, that our database is too sparse, too slippery for it to be able to mold our theories. Rather, the theories are more statements about us and ideology than about the past. Paleoanthropology, oh, this is interesting. It reveals more about how humans view themselves than it does about how humans came about. But that's heresy.
Hey, maybe that was a fair take 45 years ago, but like most sciences, paleoanthropology has come a long way. I frankly don't care what Pilbeam or Leakey said in the 1970s.
Heresy to an evolutionist. Why is this whole issue important to a creationist? First of all, we want to be true to God's word and take him just the way he speaks to us in Scripture. But it has some profound implications.
Okay, I couldn't possibly care less about his theological justifications. Basically, all he says is that if humans evolved, then there's no God setting moral rules. That's dumb, as evidenced by the majority of theists who think that there's a God with something to say about morality, and that evolution exists. And hey, that's it. I honestly hope it's the last time I cover David Menton. He was boring, he was a liar, and I frankly get very frustrated with his talks. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, hit the like button. If you didn't, tell me what you didn't like in the comments and hit the dislike button. Either way, I hope you hit the subscribe button and use the bell icon to turn on all notifications so you're always alerted when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Benthoven, Tapioca Weasel, Cynically Skeptic, Denny5252, Elron Teller, Farava, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babbity, San, Sphincter of Doom, and the Venerable Bede. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if an annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.
How